Chapter 15 of the Enchanted Barn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Gail Mattern. The Enchanted Barn by Grace Livingston Hill. Chapter 15. A man arrived one morning with a horse and a plow and several other implements of farm life of which Harley didn't know the name, and announced that Mr. Graham had sent him to plow the garden. Would Mrs. Hollister please tell him where she wanted the ground broken and how much? He volunteered the information that he was her next door neighbor, and that if he was in her place he'd plow the south slope of the meadow, and if she wanted flower beds, a strip along the front near the road. The soil was best in those spots, and she wouldn't need so much fertilizer. Mrs. Hollister asked him how much he would charge to do it, and he said a little job like that wasn't worth talking about, that he used to rent the barn himself, and he always did a little turn for Mr. Graham whenever he needed it. He did it for Mr. Graham, and it wouldn't cost her nothing. Mrs. Hollister asked him how much he would charge to see where it would be best to have the plowing done, and when she came in a few minutes later and dropped down on the couch to rest from her unusual fatigue, a new thought was racing through her mind. They could have a garden, a real garden, with lettuce and green peas and lima beans and corn. She knew all about making them grow. She had been brought up in a little village home where a garden was a part of everyone's necessary equipment for living. She used to help her father every spring and all summer. Her own little patch always took the prize of the family. But for years she had been in the city without an inch of space. Now, however, the old fever of delight in gardening took possession of her. If she could get out and work in the ground as the doctor had suggested, she would get well right away. And why, with Harley to help, and George and Carol to work a little every evening, couldn't they raise enough on all that ground to sell some? George could take things into town early in the morning, or they could find some private families who would buy all they had to sell. It was worth thinking about, anyway. She could raise flowers for sale, too. She had always been a success with flowers. She had always wanted a hothouse and a chance to experiment. She heard the children say there were some old window sashes down under the barn. She would get George to bring them out and see what she could do with a cold frame or two. Violets would grow under a cold frame, and lots of other things. Oh, if they could only just live here always and not have to go back to the city in the fall! But of course there was no way to heat the barn in winter, and that was out of the question. Nevertheless, the idea of making some money with growing things had seized hold of her mind and would not be entirely put by. She thought of it much, and talked of it now and then to Shirley and the other children. Shirley brought home some packages of seeds she got at the 10-cent store, and there was great excitement planting them. Then Mr. Graham sent over a lot of seeds of both vegetables and flowers, and some shrubs, cuttings, and bulbs, which he said were leftovers at their country house that he thought perhaps the children could use. And so, before the Hollisters knew it, they were possessed of a garden which almost in a breath lifted up its green head and began to grow. Life was very full for the Hollisters in those days, and those who went to the city for the day could hardly bear to tear themselves away from the many delights of the country. The puppy was getting bigger and wiser every day, tagging Doris and Harley wherever they went, or sitting adoringly at Mrs. Hollister's feet, always bounding out to meet the evening trolley on which George and Shirley came, and always attending them to the trolley in the morning. Out behind the barn a tiny coop held a white hen and her 7 little downy balls of chickens. Another hen was happily ensconced in a barrel of hay with 10 big blue duck eggs under her happy wings, and a little further down toward the creek a fine chicken run ended in a trig little roosting place for the poultry, which George had manufactured out of a packing box and some boards. The feathered family had been increased by 2 white leghorns and 3 bantams. George and Harley spent their evenings watching them and discussing the price of eggs and chickens per pound. They were all very happy. Elizabeth came out to spend Sunday as she had promised. She got up early to see the sunrise and watch the birds. She helped get breakfast and wash the dishes. Then she went with the others across the fields to the little white church in the valley, to Sunday school and church. She was as hungry and eager as any of them when she came home, and joyfully helped to do the work, taking great pride in the potatoes she was allowed to warm up under careful tutelage. In the afternoon there was no more eager listener among them to the Bible story Shirley told to Doris, and the book she read aloud to them all afterward. Her voice was sweetest and clearest of them all in the hymns they sang together, and she was most eager to go with Shirley to the Christian Endeavor. I shouldn't wonder if Sidney wishes he was here too," she remarked dreamily that evening as she sat before the fire on a little cushion, her chin in her hands, her eyes on the fantastic shadows in the ashes. She went to school with Carol the next morning, came home with her in the afternoon, and when her brother came for her in the evening she was most reluctant to go home to the big, lonely, elegant house again, and begged that Carol might soon come and see her. Friday afternoon Elizabeth called up Mrs. Hollister. "Please, Mrs. Hollister, let Carol come and stay with me till Monday. I'm so lonesome, and mamma says she will be so glad if you will let her come." " Oh, my dear, that would be impossible. Carol isn't suitably dressed to make a visit, you know," answered the mother quickly, glad that she had so good an excuse for keeping her child from this venture into an alien world about which she had many grave doubts. But the young voice at the other end of the telephone was insistent. "Dear Mrs. Hollister, please! She doesn't need any other clothes. I've got lots of things that would fit her. She loaned me her gingham dress to make garden in, and why shouldn't I loan her a dress to wear on Sunday? I've got plenty of clean middy blouses and skirts, and can fix her all out fresh for school, too, Monday morning. And if you'll just let her stay, Sidney will take us both down to her school when he goes to the office. You've got all those children there at home, and I've only myself. Sidney doesn't count, you know, for he's grown up." So with a sigh the mother gave her consent, and Carol found the Graham car waiting for her when she came out of school. Thus she started on her first venture into the world. It was all like fairyland, that wonderful week end to the little girl whose memories were full of burdens and sacrifices. The palatial home of many rooms and rich furnishings, the swarm of servants, the anticipation of every want, the wide, beautiful grounds, with all that heart could wish in the way of beauty and amusement, the music room with grand piano, harp, and violin lying mute most of the time, the great library with its walls lined with rare books, mostly unread. Everything there to satisfy any whim, reasonable or unreasonable, and nobody using any of it much. "Not a room in the whole place as dear and cozy and homey as this," sighed Carol happily, sinking into the old denim covered couch before the fireplace in the barn living room that Monday night after she got home. "I declare, mother, I don't see how Elizabeth stands it. Her mother is nice, but she's hardly ever there, unless she has a swarm of people dinnering or teaing or lunching. She hardly ever has time to speak to Elizabeth, and Elizabeth doesn't seem to care much either. She almost seems to think more of that old nurse Susan that took care of her when she was a baby than she does of her mother. I'm so glad I was sent to you instead of to her." And Carol suddenly slipped across the room and buried her face in her mother's neck, hugging and kissing her, leaving a few bright tears on her mother's happy face. It was a wonderful relief to Mrs. Hollister to find her child unspoiled by her first experience of the world, and glad to get back to her home after all the anxiety her mother heart had felt. Carol presently sat up and told them minutely all about her visit, the grand concert that Sidney had taken them to Friday evening in the Academy of Music, where a world renowned pianist was the soloist with the great symphony orchestra, the tennis and riding Saturday morning, the luncheon at a neighboring estate, where there were three girls and a brother who were snobs and hadn't at all good manners, the party in the evening that lasted so late that they didn't get to bed till long after midnight, the beautiful room they slept in, with every imaginable article for the toilet done in sterling silver with monograms, the strange Sabbath, with no service in the morning because they woke up too late, and no suggestion of anything but a holiday, except the vesper service in a cold, formal chapel that Carol had begged to go to. Just a lot of worldly music and entertaining, with a multitude of visitors for the end of it. Carol told of the beautiful dresses that Elizabeth had loaned her, coral crepe de chine accordion pleated for the concert, white with an orange sash for the luncheon, pale yellow with a black velvet girdle for the party, a little blue silk affair and another lovely white organdy for Sunday, and all with their accompanying silk stockings and slippers and gloves, and necklaces and bands for her hair. It was most wonderful to her, and as they listened they marveled that their Carol had come back to them so gladly, and rejoiced to see her nestling in her brown linen skirt and middy blouse close beside her mother's chair. She declared herself satisfied with her flight into the world. She might like to go again for a glimpse now and then, but she thought she would rather have Elizabeth out to Glenside. She hated to lose any of the time out here, it was so pretty. Besides, it was lonesome without them all. About that time Shirley picked up the morning paper in her office one day to look up a matter for Mr. Barnard. Her eye happened to fall on the society column and catch the name of Sidney Graham. She glanced down the column. It was an account of a wedding in high circles in which Graham had taken the part of best man, with Miss Harriet Hale in blue tulle and white orchids as maid of honor for his partner down the aisle. She read the column hurriedly, hungrily, getting every detail, white spats, gardenia, and all, until in those few printed sentences a picture was printed indelibly upon her vision of Graham walking down the lily garlanded aisle with the maid in blue tulle and white orchids on his arm. To make it more vivid, the lady's picture was in the paper along with Graham's, just under those of the bride and groom, and her face was both handsome and haughty. One could tell that by the tilt of her chin, the short upper lip, the cynical curve of mouth and sweep of long eyelash, the extreme effect of her dress, and the arrangement of her hair. Only a beauty could have stood that hair and not been positively ugly. Shirley suddenly realized what she was doing, and turned over the page of the paper with a jerk that tore the sheet from top to bottom, going on with her search for the real estate column and the item she was after. All that morning her typewriter keys clicked with mad rapidity, yet her work was strangely correct and perfect. She was working under a tense strain. By noon she had herself in hand, realized what she had been doing with her vagrant thoughts, and was able to laugh at Miss Harriet Hale, whoever or whatever she was. What mattered it, Miss Harriet Hale or somebody else? What was that to Shirley Hollister? Mr. Graham was her landlord, and a kindly gentleman. He would probably continue to be that to her to the end of her tenancy, without regard to Miss Hale or any other intruding miss. And what did anything else matter? She wanted nothing else of Mr. Graham but to be a kindly gentleman whenever it was her necessity to come in his way. But although her philosophy was on hand and her pride was aroused, she realized just where her heart might have been tending if it had not been for this little jolt it got, and she resolved to keep out of the gentleman's way whenever it was possible, and also, as far as she was able, to think no more about him. Keeping out of Sidney Graham's way was one thing, but making him keep out of her way was quite another matter, and Shirley realized it every time he came out to Glenside, which he did quite frequently. She could not say to him that she wished he would not come. She could not be rude to him when he came. There was no way of showing him pointedly that she was not thinking of him in any way but as her landlord, because he never showed in any way that he was expecting her to. He just happened in, evening after evening, in his frank, jolly way, on one pretext or other, never staying very long, never showing her any more attention than he did her mother or Carol or the boys, not so much as he did to Doris. How was she to do anything but sit quietly and take the whole thing as a matter of course? It really was a matter to deal with in her own heart alone, and there the battle must be fought if ever battle there was to be. Meantime, she could not but own that this frank, smiling, merry young man did bring a lot of life and pleasure into their lives, dropping in that way, and why should she not enjoy it when it came, seeing it in no wise interfered with Miss Harriet Hale's rights and prerogatives? Nevertheless, Shirley withdrew more and more into quietness whenever he came, and often slipped into the kitchen on some household pretext, until one day he boldly came out into the kitchen after her with a book he wanted her to read, and was so frank and companionable that she led the way back to the living room and concluded it would be better in future to stay with the rest of the family. Shirley had no intention whatever of letting her heart stray out after any impossible society man. She had her work in the world, and to it she meant to stick. If there were dreams, she kept them well under lock and key, and only took them out now and then at night when she was very tired and discouraged, and life looked hard and long and lonely on ahead. Shirley had no intention that Sidney Graham should ever have reason to think, when he married Miss Harriet Hale, or someone equivalent to her, that any poor little stenographer living in a barn had at one time fancied him fond of her. No, indeed. Shirley tilted her firm little chin at the thought, and declined to ride with Graham and Elizabeth the next time they called at the office for her, on the plea that she had promised to go home in the trolley with one of the office girls. And yet, the next time she saw him he was just as pleasant, and showed no sign that she had declined his invitation. In fact, the whole basis of their acquaintance was such that she felt free to go her own way and yet know he would be just as pleasant a friend whenever she needed one. Matters stood in this way when Graham was suddenly obliged to go West on a trip for the office, to be gone 3 or 4 weeks. Mrs. Graham and Elizabeth went to the Adirondacks for a short trip, and the people at Glenside settled down to quiet country life, broken only by a few visits from their farm neighbors and a call from the cheery, shabby pastor of the little white church in the valley. CHAPTER XVI of the Enchanted Barn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Gail Mattern. The Enchanted Barn by Grace Livingston Hill. Chapter 16. Graham did not seem to forget his friends entirely while he was gone. The boys received a number of postcards from time to time, and a lot of fine views of California, Yellowstone Park, the Grand Cañon, and other spots of interest. A wonderful picture book came for Doris, with Chinese pictures and rhymes printed on crepe paper. The next morning a tiny sandalwood fan arrived for Carol, with Graham's compliments, and a few days later a big box of oranges for Mrs. Hollister, with no clue whatever as to their sender. Shirley began to wonder what her part would be, and what she should do about it, and presently received a letter. And then, after all, it was only a pleasant request that she would not pay the rent, about which she had always been so punctual, until his return, as no one else understood about his affairs. He added a few words about his pleasant trip, and a wish that they were all prospering, and that was all. Shirley was disappointed, of course, and yet if he had said more, or if he had ventured to send her even a mere trifle of a gift, it would have made her uncomfortable and set her questioning how she should treat him and it. It was the perfection of his behavior that he had not overstepped a single bound that the most particular might set for a landlord and his respected tenant. She drew a deep sigh and put the letter back into the envelope, and as she did so she spied a small card, smaller than the envelope, on which was an exquisite bit of scenery, a colored photograph apparently, and underneath had been penciled, "One of the many beautiful spots in California that I am sure you would appreciate." Her heart gave an unforbidden leap and was promptly taken to task for it. Yet when Shirley went back to her typewriter the bit of a picture was pinned to the wall back of her desk, and her eyes rested on it many times that day when she lifted them from her work. It is questionable whether Shirley remembered Miss Harriet Hale at all that day. The garden was growing beautifully now. There would soon be lettuce and radishes ready to eat. George had secured a number of customers through people at the store, and was planning to take early trips to town when his produce was ripe to deliver it. They watched every night and looked again every morning for signs of the first pea blossoms, and the little green spires of onion tops, like sparse hairs beginning to shoot up. Every day brought some new wonder. They almost forgot they had ever lived in the little old brick house, until George rode by there on his bicycle one noon and reported that it had been half pulled down, and you could now see the outline of where the stairs and closets had been, done in plaster, on the side of the next house. They were all very silent for a minute, thinking after he told that, and Mrs. Hollister looked around the great airy place in which they were sitting, and then out the open door where the faint stain of sunset was still lingering against the horizon, and said: "We ought all to be very thankful, children. George, get the Bible and read the 34th Psalm." Wonderingly George obeyed, and they all sat listening as the words sank into their souls. "Now," said the mother when the psalm was finished and those last words, "The Lord redeemeth the soul of his servants, and none of them that trust in him shall be desolate. Now let us kneel down and thank him." And they all knelt while she prayed a few earnest, simple words of thanksgiving, and commended them to God's keeping. By this time Mrs. Hollister was so well that she went every day for a little while into the garden and worked, and was able to do a great deal in the house. The children were overjoyed, and lived in a continual trance of delight over the wild, free life they were living. Carol's school had closed, and Carol was at home all day. This made one more to help in the garden. George was talking about building a little pigeon house and raising squabs for sale. The man who did the plowing had given him a couple to start with, and told him there was money in squabs if one only went about it right. George and Harley pored over a book that told all about it, and talked much on the subject. The weather was growing warm, and Shirley was wishing her vacation came in July or August instead of the first 2 weeks in September. Somehow she felt so used up these hot days, and the hours dragged by so slowly. At night the trolleys were crowded until they were halfway out to Glenside. She often had to stand, and her head ached a great deal. Yet she was very happy and thankful. Only there was so much to be done in this world, and she seemed to have so little strength to do it all. The burden of next fall came occasionally to mar the beauty of the summer, and rested heavily upon her young shoulders. If only there wouldn't be any winter for just 1 year, and they could stay in the barn and get rested, and get a little money ahead somehow for moving. It was going to be so hard to leave that wide, beautiful, abiding place, barn though it was. One morning, nearly 4 weeks after Graham left for California, Shirley was called from her desk to the outer office to take some dictation for Mr. Clegg. While she was there, 2 men entered the outer office and asked for Mr. Barnard. One of them was a short, thick-set man with a pretentious wide gray mustache parted in the middle and combed elaborately out on his cheeks. He had a red face, little cunning eyes, and a cruel set to his jaw which somehow seemed ridiculously at variance with his loud check suit, sporty necktie of soft bright blue satin, set with a scarf pin of 2 magnificent stones, a diamond and a sapphire, and with the 3 showy jeweled rings which he wore on his fat, pudgy hand. The other man was sly, quiet, gray, unobtrusive, obviously the henchman of the first. Mr. Clegg told the men they might go into the inner office and wait for Mr. Barnard, who would probably be in shortly, and Shirley watched them as they passed out of her view, wondering idly why those exquisite stones had to be wasted in such an out-of-place spot as in that coarse-looking man's necktie, and if a man like that really cared for beautiful things, else why should he wear them? It was only a passing thought, and then she took up her pencil and took down the closing sentences of the letter Mr. Clegg was dictating. It was but a moment more, and she was free to go back to her own little alcove just behind Mr. Barnard's office and connecting with it. There was an entrance to it from the tiny cloakroom, which she always used when Mr. Barnard had visitors in his office, and through this way she now went, having a strange repugnance toward being seen by the 2 men. She had an innate sense that the man with the gaudy garments would not be one who would treat a young girl in her position with any respect, and she did not care to come under his coarse gaze, so she slipped in quietly through the cloakroom and passed like a shadow the open door into Mr. Barnard's office, where they sat with their backs toward her, having evidently just settled down and begun to talk. She could hear a low-breathed comment on the furnishings of the office as indicating a good bank account of the owner, and a coarse jest about a photograph of Mr. Barnard's wife which stood on his desk. It made her wish that the door between the rooms was closed, yet she did not care to rise and close it, lest she should call attention to herself, and of course it might be but a minute or 2 before Mr. Barnard returned. A pile of envelopes to be addressed lay on her desk, and this work she could do without any noise, so she slipped softly into her seat and began to work. "Well, we got them Grahams good and fast now," a coarse voice that she knew for that of the man with the loud clothing spoke. "The young feller bit all right. I thought he would. He's that kind." He stopped for a laugh of contempt, and Shirley's heart stood still with apprehension. What could it mean? Was it something about her Grahams? Some danger threatening them? Some game being played on them? He looked like the kind of man who lived on the blindnesses of others. What was it they called such? A parasite? Instinctively she was on the alert at once, and automatically she reached for the pad on which she took dictation and began to write down in shorthand what she had just heard. The voice in the other room went on, and her fountain pen kept eager pace, her breath coming quick and short now, and her face white with excitement. "He went out to see the place, you know, examine the mines and all that. Oh, he's awful cautious. Thought he took a government expert with him to test the ore. We fixed that up all right. Had the very man on tap at the right minute. Government papers all okay. You couldn't have told him from the real thing. It was Casey. You know him. He's a crackerjack on a job like that. Could fool the devil himself. Well, he swore it was the finest kind of ore and all that kind of dope, and led that Graham kid around as sweetly as a blue-eyed baby. We had a gang out there all bribed, you know, to swear to things, and took particular pains so Graham would go around and ask the right ones questions. Casey tended to that,
and now he's come home with the biggest kind of a tale and ready to boost the thing to the skies. I've got his word for it, and his daddy is to sign the papers this morning. When he wakes up one of these fine days he'll find himself minus 100,000 or so, and nobody to blame for it, because how could anybody be expected to know that those are only pockets? He'll recommend it right and left, too, and we'll clean out a lot of other fellas before we get done. Teddy, my boy, pat yourself on the back. We'll have a tidy little sum between us when we pull out of this deal and take a foreign trip for our health till the fracas blows over. Now, mind you, not a word of this to Barnard when he comes in. We're only going to pave the way this morning. The real tip comes from Graham himself. See?
Shirley was faint and dizzy with excitement as she finished writing, and her brain was in a whirl. She felt as if she would scream in a minute if this strain kept up. The papers were to be signed that morning. Even now the deed might be done, and it would be too late perhaps to stop it. And yet she must make no sign, must not have the men know that she was there and that they had been heard. She must sit here breathless until they were gone, so they would not know she had overheard them, or they might manage to prevent her getting word to Graham. How long would they stay? Would they talk on and reveal more? The other man had only grunted something unintelligible in reply, and then, before more could be said, an office boy opened the outer door and told them that Mr. Barnard had just phoned that he would not be back before 2:00. The men swore and went out grumbling. Suddenly Shirley knew her time had come to do something. Stepping quickly to the door, she scanned the room carefully to make sure they were gone. Then, closing her own door, she took up the telephone on her desk and called up the Graham number. She did not know just what she meant to say, nor what she would do if Sidney Graham were not in the office, and it was hardly probable he would be there yet if he had only arrived home the day before. He would be likely to take a day off before getting back to work. Her throbbing heart beat out those questions to her brain while she waited for the number. Would she dare ask for Mr. Walter Graham? And if she did, what would she say to him? How explain? He did not know her and probably never heard of her. He might think her crazy. Then there was always the possibility that there was some mistake, and yet it seemed a coincidence that two men of the same name should both be going west at that time. It must be these Grahams that the plot was against, but how explain enough over the phone to do any good? Of course she must give them a copy of what she had taken down in shorthand, but first she must stop the signing of those papers, whatever they were, at all costs. Then all at once, into the midst of her whirling confusion of thoughts, came a voice at the other end of the phone. "Hello?" And her frantic senses realized that it was a familiar one. "Oh, is this is Mr. Sidney Graham, isn't it? This is Shirley Hollister." There was a catch in her voice that sounded almost like a sob as she drew in her breath with relief to know that he was there, and his answer came in swift alarm. "Yes. Is there anything the matter, Miss Shirley? You are not ill, are you?" There was a sharp note of anxiety in the young man's voice, and even in her excitement it made Shirley's heart leap to hear it. "No, there is nothing the matter with me," she said, trying to steady her voice, "but something has happened that I think you ought to know at once. I don't know whether I ought to tell it over the phone. I'm not sure, but I may be overheard." "I will come to you immediately. Where can I find you?" Her heart leaped again at his willingness to trust her and to obey her call. "In Mr. Barnard's private office. If you ask for me they will let you come right in. There is one thing more. If there is anything important your father was to decide this morning, could you get him to wait till you return, or till you phone him?" There was a second's hesitation, and the reply was politely puzzled but courteous. "He is not in the office at present, and will not be for an hour." "Oh, I'm so glad! Then please hurry." "I will get there as soon as I can," and the phone clicked into place. Shirley sat back in her chair and pressed her hands over her eyes to concentrate all her powers. Then she turned to her typewriter and began to copy off the shorthand, her fingers flying over the keys with more than their usual swiftness. As she wrote she prayed that nothing might have been signed and that her warning might not come too late. Prayed, too, that Mr. Barnard might not return until Mr. Graham had been and gone, and that Mr. Graham might not think her an utter fool in case this proved to have nothing whatever to do with his affairs. Chapter 17 of the Enchanted Barn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Gail Mattern. The Enchanted Barn by Grace Livingston Hill. Chapter 17. When Graham entered the office, Shirley came to meet him quietly, without a word of greeting other than to put her little cold hand into his that he held out to her. She began to speak in a low voice full of suppressed excitement. She had a vague fear lest the two men might be still lingering about the outer office waiting for Mr. Barnard, and a momentary dread lest Mr. Barnard might enter the room at any minute. She must get the telling over before he came. "Mr. Graham, two men were sitting in this room waiting for Mr. Barnard a few minutes ago, and I was in my little room just back there. I could not help hearing what they said, and when I caught the name of Graham in connection with what sounded like an evil plot, I took down their words in shorthand. It may not have anything to do with your firm, but I thought I ought to let you know. I called you on the phone as soon as they left the office and would not hear me, and I have made this copy of their conversation. Read it quickly, please, because if it does have anything to do with you, you will want to phone your father at once, before those men can get there." Her tone was very cool, and her hand was steady as she handed him the typewritten paper, but her heart was beating wildly, because there had been a look in his eyes as he greeted her that made her feel that he was glad to see her, and it touched an answering gladness in her heart, and filled her both with delight and with apprehension. What a fool she was! She turned sharply away, and busied herself with arranging some papers on Mr. Barnard's desk while he read. She must still this excitement and get control of herself before he was through. She must be the cool, impersonal stenographer, and not let him suspect for a moment that she was so excited about seeing him again. The young man stood still, reading rapidly, his face growing graver as he read. The girl snatched a furtive glance at him, and felt convinced that the matter was a serious one and had to do with him. Suddenly he looked up. "Do you know who those men were, Miss Shirley?" he asked, and she saw his eyes were full of anxiety. "No," said Shirley, "but I saw them as they passed through the outer office, and stopped to speak to Mr. Clegg. I was taking dictation for Mr. Clegg at the time. I came back to my desk through the cloakroom, so they did not know I was within hearing." "What kind of looking men were they? Do you remember?" She described them. Certainty grew in his face as she talked, and grave concern. "May I use your phone a minute?" he asked, after an instant's thought. She led him to her own desk and handed him the receiver, then stepped back into the office and waited. "Hello, is that you, Edward?" she heard him say. "Has father come yet? Give me his phone, please. Hello, father, this is Sidney. Father, has Kremnitz come in yet? He has? You say he's waiting in the office to see you? Well, don't see him, father, till I get there. Something has turned up that I'm afraid is going to alter matters entirely." "Yes, pretty serious, I'm afraid. Don't see him. Keep him waiting. I'll be there in 5 minutes, and come in from the back way directly to your office. Don't talk with him on any account till I can get there. Good bye." He hung up the receiver and turned to Shirley. "Miss Shirley, you were just in time to save us. I haven't time now to tell you how grateful I am for this. I must hurry right over. Do you suppose if we should need you, it would be possible for you to come over and identify those men? Thank you. I'll speak to Mr. Clegg about it as I go out, and if we find it necessary, we'll phone you. In case you have to come, I'll have an office boy in the hall to take your hat, and you can come right into the office as if you were one of our employees. Just walk over to the bookcase as if you were looking for a book, any book. Select one and look through it, meanwhile glancing around the room, and see if you find those men. Then walk through into my office. I'll be waiting there. Good bye, and thank you so much." He gave her hand one quick clasp and was gone, and Shirley found she was trembling from head to foot. She walked quickly into her own room and sat down, burying her face in her hands and trying to get control of herself, but the tears would come to her eyes in spite of all she could do. It was not the excitement of getting the men and stopping their evil plans before they could do any damage, although that had something to do with her nervous state, of course. And it was not just that she had been able to do a little thing in return for all he had done for her, nor even his gratitude. It was, she could not deny it to herself, it was a certain quality in his voice as something in the look he gave her that made her whole soul glow, and seemed to fill the hungry longing that had been in her heart. It frightened her and made her ashamed, and as she sat with bowed head she prayed that she might be given strength to act like a sensible girl, and crush out such foolish thoughts before they dared lift their heads and be recognized even by her own heart. Then, strengthened, she resolved to think no more about the matter, but just get her work done, and be ready to enter into that other business if it became necessary. Mr. Barnard would be coming soon, and she must have his work finished. She had lost almost an hour by this matter. She went at her typewriter pell-mell, and soon had Mr. Clegg's letters done. She was nearly through with the addressing that Mr. Barnard left for her to do when the telephone called her to Graham's office. She slipped on her hat and hurried out. " Will it be all right for me to take my noontime now, Mr. Clegg?" she said, stopping by his desk. " Mr. Graham said he spoke to you." "Yes, he wants you to help him identify someone. That's all right. I'll explain to Mr. Barnard when he comes. There's nothing important you have to finish, is there? All done but those envelopes? Well, you needn't return until 1 o'clock, anyway. The envelopes can wait till the 4 o'clock mail. And if Mr. Barnard needs anything in a hurry, Miss Dwight can attend to it this time. Just take your time, Miss Hollister." Shirley went out, bewildered by the unusual generosity of Mr. Clegg, who was usually taciturn and abrupt. She realized, however, that his warmth must be due to Graham's visit, and not to any special desire to give her a holiday. She smiled to think what a difference wealth and position made in the eyes of the world. The same office boy she had met on her first visit to Graham's office was waiting most respectfully for her now in the hall when she got out of the elevator, and she gave him her hat and walked into the office according to program, going straight to the big glass bookcase full of calf-bound volumes and selecting one after running her finger over 2 rows of them. She was as cool as though her part had been rehearsed many times, although her heart was pounding most unmercifully, and it seemed as though the people in the next room must hear it. She stood and opened her book, casting a casual glance about the room. There, sure enough, quite near to her, sat the 2 men, fairly bursting with impatience. The once immaculate hair of the loudly dressed one was rumpled as if he had run his fingers through it many times, and he played nervously with his heavy rings, and caressed half viciously his elaborate mustache, working his thick, sensuous lips impatiently all the while. Shirley took a good look at him, necktie, scarf pin, and all, looked keenly into the face of the gray one also, then coolly closed the door of the bookcase and carried the book she had selected into Sidney Graham's office. Graham was there, standing to receive her, and just back of him stood a kindly faced, elderly man with merry blue eyes, gray hair, and a stylishly cut beard. By their attitude and manner, Shirley somehow sensed that they had both been watching her. Then Graham introduced her. " This is my father, Miss Hollister." The elder man took her hand and shook it heartily, speaking in a gruff, hearty way that won her from the first. " I'm glad to know you, Miss Hollister. I certainly am. My son has been telling me what you've done for us, and I think you're a great little girl. That was bully work you did, and I appreciate it. I was watching you out there in the office. You were as cool as a cucumber. You ought to be a detective. You found your men all right, did you?" " Yes, sir," said Shirley, much abashed, and feeling the return of that foolish trembling in her limbs. " Yes, they are both out there, and the short one with the rings and the blue necktie is the one that did the talking." " Exactly what I thought," drawled the father with a keen twinkle in his kindly eyes. " I couldn't somehow trust that chap from the start. That's why I sent my son out to investigate. Well, now, will you just step into my private office, Miss Hollister, and take your seat by the typewriter as if you were my stenographer? You'll find paper there in the drawer, and you can just be writing. Write anything you choose so it looks natural when the men come in. When we get to talking, I'd like you to take down in shorthand all that is said by all of us. You're pretty good at that, I judge. Sid, will you phone for those officers now? I think it's about time for the curtain to rise." And he led the way into his own office. Shirley sat down at the typewriter as she had been directed and began to write mechanically. Mr. Graham touched the bell on his desk and told the office boy who answered to send in Mr. Kremnitz and his companion. Shirley was so seated that she could get occasional glimpses of the men without being noticed, and she was especially interested in the twinkle that shone in the bright blue eyes of the elder Graham as he surveyed the men who thought he was their dupe. Her heart warmed to him. His kindly, merry face, his hearty, unconventional speech, all showed him to be a big, warm-hearted man without a bit of snobbishness about him. The sun came in, and talk began just as if the matter of the mine were going on. Mr. Kremnitz produced some papers, which he evidently expected to be signed at once, and sat complacently answering questions, keen questions Shirley saw they were afterwards, and in the light of the revelation she had overheard in Mr. Barnard's office, Kremnitz perjured himself hopelessly by his answers. Presently the office boy announced the arrival of some one in the next room. Shirley had taken down minutely a great deal of valuable information which the Grahams had together drawn from their victim. She was surprised at the list of wealthy business men who were to have been involved in the scheme. Then suddenly the quiet scene changed. The elder Graham gave a signal to his office boy, which looked merely like waving him away, and the door was flung open, revealing 4 officers of the law, who stepped into the room without further word. Graham arose and faced his 2 startled callers, his hand firmly planted on the papers on his desk which he had been supposed to sign. " Mr. Kremnitz," he said, and even in the midst of this serious business Shirley fancied there was a half comic drawl to his words. He simply could not help letting his sense of humor come on top. " Mr. Kremnitz, it is not going to be possible for me to sign these papers this morning as you expected. I do not feel satisfied that all things are as you have represented. In fact, I have the best evidence to the contrary. Officer, these are the gentlemen you have come to arrest," said he, and he stepped back and waved his hand toward the 2 conspirators, who sat with startled eyes and blanched faces, appalled at the sudden developments where they had thought all was moving happily toward their desired end. "Arrest? Who? On what charge?" flashed the little gaudy Kremnitz, angrily springing to his feet and making a dash toward the door, while his companion slid furtively toward the other end of the room, evidently hoping to gain young Graham's office before he was noticed. But 2 officers blocked their way, and the handcuffs clanked in the hands of the other 2 policemen. " Why arrest you, my friend," said Graham Senior, as if he rather enjoyed the little man's discomfiture, " and for trying to perpetrate the biggest swindle that has been attempted for 10 years. I must say for you that you've worked hard and done the trick rather neatly, but you made one unfortunate slip that saved all us poor rich men. It seems a pity that so much elaborate lying should have brought you to nothing but those bracelets you're wearing. They don't seem to match well with your other jewels, but that's the way things go in this world. Now take them away, officer. I have no more time to waste on them this morning." And he turned and walked over by Shirley's desk while the curtain fell over the brief drama. "Do you know how much money you've saved for us, little girl? Just plain saved? I'll tell you. A clean $100,000. That's what I was going to put into this affair. And as for other men, I expected to influence a lot of other men to put in a good deal also. Now, little girl, I don't know what you think about it, but I want to shake hands." He put out his hand, and Shirley laid her own timid one in it, smiling and blushing rosily, and saying softly with what excited breath she had, " Oh, I'm so glad I got to you in time." Then she was aware that the man had gone on talking. " I don't know what you think about it," he repeated, " but I feel that you saved me a clean $100,000, and I say that a good percentage of that belongs to you as a reward of your quickness and keenness." But Shirley drew away her hand and stepped back, her face white, her head up, her chin tilted proudly, her eyes very dark with excitement and determination. She spoke clearly and earnestly. " No, Mr. Graham, nothing whatever belongs to me. I don't want any reward. I couldn't think of taking it. It is utterly out of the question." " Well, well, well !" said the elder Graham, sitting down on the edge of his desk, watching her in undisguised admiration. " Now that's a new kind of girl that won't take what she's earned, what rightly belongs to her." " Mr. Graham, it was a very little thing I did. Anybody would have done it, and it was just in the way of simple duty. Please don't say anything more about it. I am only too glad to have had opportunity to give a little help to people who have helped me so much. I feel that I am under deep obligation to your son for making it possible for us to live in the country where my mother is getting well." " Well, now, I shall have to inquire into this business. I haven't heard anything about obligations, and for my part I feel a big one just now.
Perhaps you think it was a very little thing you did, but suppose you hadn't done it. Suppose you'd been too busy, or it hadn't occurred to you to take down that conversation until it was too late, or suppose you hadn't had the brains to see what it would mean to us, why, then it would have become a very big thing indeed, and we should have been willing, if we had known, to pay a mighty big sum to get that evidence. You see, $100,000 isn't exactly a very little thing when you're swindled out of it. It's the swindling that hurts more than the loss of the money, and you saved us from that. Now, young lady, I consider myself under obligation to you, and I intend to discharge it somehow. If I can't do it one way, I shall another. But in the meantime, I'm deeply grateful, and please accept our thanks. If you are willing to add one more to your kindness, I shall be glad if you will make a carbon copy of those shorthand notes you took. I may need them for evidence. And by the way, you will probably be called upon to testify in court. I'm sorry. That may be unpleasant, but I guess it can't be helped. So you see, before you get through, you may not think you did so very small a thing after all. Sid, I think you better escort this young lady back to her office and explain to Barnard. He's probably been on the verge of being buncoed also. You said Kremnitz was waiting for him when the conversation took place. I guess you better go with Miss Hollister and clear the whole thing up. Say, child, have you had your lunch yet? No, of course not. Sidney, you take her to get some lunch before she goes back to the office. She's had an exciting morning. Now, good-bye, little girl. I shan't forget what you've done for us, and I'm coming to see you pretty soon and get things squared up.
So that was how it came about that in spite of her protests, Mr. Sidney Graham escorted Shirley Hollister into one of the most exclusive tea rooms of the city and seated her at a little round table set for two, while off at a short distance Miss Harriet Hale sat with her mother, eating her lunch and trying in vain to "place" the pretty girl she did not recognize. It never occurred to her for a moment that Sidney Graham's companion might be a stenographer, for Shirley had a knack about her clothes that made her always seem well dressed. That hat she wore had seen service for 3 summers, and was now a wholly different shape and color from what it had been when it began life. A scrub in hot water had removed the dust of toil, some judiciously applied dye had settled the matter of color, and a trifling manipulation on her head while the hat was still wet had made the shape not only exceedingly stylish but becoming. The chic little rosette and strictly tailored band, which were its sole trimming, were made from a much soiled waist ribbon, washed and stretched around a bottle of hot water to dry it, and teased into the latest thing in rosettes by Shirley's witching fingers. The simple linen dress she wore fitted well, and at a distance could not have been told from something better, and neither were gloves and shoes near enough to be inspected critically, so Miss Hale was puzzled, and jealously watched the pretty color come and go in Shirley's cheek and the simple grace of her movements. Fortunately, Shirley did not see Miss Hale, and would not have recognized her if she had, from that one brief glimpse she had of her picture on the society page of the newspaper. So she ate her delectable lunch, ordered by Graham, in terms that she knew not, about dishes that she had never seen before. She ate and enjoyed herself so intensely that it seemed to her she would never be able to make the rest of her life measure up to the privileges of the hour. For Shirley was a normal girl. She could not help being pleased to be doing just for once exactly as other more favored girls did constantly. To be lunching at Blanco's with one of the most sought after men in the upper set, to be treated like a queen, and to be talking beautiful things about travels and pictures and books, it was all too beautiful to be real. Shirley began to feel that if it didn't get over pretty soon and find her back in the office addressing the rest of those envelopes, she would think she had died in the midst of a dream and gone to heaven. There was something else, too, that brought an undertone of beauty, which she was not acknowledging even to her inmost self. That was the way Graham looked at her, as if she were some fine, beautiful angel dropped down from above that he loved to look at, as if he really cared what she thought and did, as if there were somehow a soul harmony between them that set them apart this day from others and put them into tune with one another, as if he were glad, glad to see her once more after the absence. All through her being it thrilled like a song that brings tears to the throat and gladness to the eyes and makes one feel strong and pure. That was how it seemed when she thought about it afterward. At the time she was just living it in wonder and thanksgiving. At another time her sordid worldliness and pride might have risen and swelled with haughtiness of spirit over the number of people who eyed her enviously as they went out together, over the many bows and salutations her escort received from people of evident consequence, for she had the normal human pride somewhere in her nature, as we all have. But just then her heart was too humble with the new, strange happiness to feel it or take it in, and she walked with unconscious grace beside him, feeling only the joy of being there. Later, in the quiet of her chamber, her mother's warning came to her, and her cheeks burned with shame in the dark that her heart had dared make so much of a common little luncheon, just a mere courtesy after she had been able to do a favor. Yet through it all Shirley knew there was something fine and true there that belonged just to her, and presently she would rise above everything and grasp it and keep it hers forever. She felt the distinction of her escort anew when she entered Barnard and Clegg's in his company, and saw Mr. Clegg spring to open the door and to set a chair for his young guest; saw even Mr. Barnard rise and greet him with almost reverence. And this honor she knew was being paid to Money, the great demagogue. It was not the man that she admired to whom they were paying deference. It was to his money. She smiled to herself. It was the man she admired, not his money. All that afternoon she worked with flying fingers, turning off the work at marvelous speed, amused when she heard the new note of respect in Mr. Barnard's voice as he gave her a direction. Mr. Barnard had been greatly impressed with the story Graham had told him, and was also deeply grateful on his own account that Shirley had acted as she had, for he had been on the verge of investing a large trust fund that was in his keeping in the new mining operation, and it would have meant absolute failure for him. When Shirley left the office that night she was almost too tired to see which trolley was coming, but some one touched her on the arm, and there was Sidney Graham waiting for her beside his car, a little two passenger affair that she had never seen before and that went like the wind. They took a road they had not traveled together before, and Shirley got in joyously, her heart all in a tumult of doubts and joys and questions. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of The Enchanted Barn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Gail Mattern. The Enchanted Barn by Grace Livingston Hill. Chapter 18. What that ride was to Shirley she hardly dared let herself think afterwards. Sitting cozily beside Graham in the little racing car, gliding through the better part of town where all the tall, imposing houses slept with drawn blinds and dust-covered shutters proclaimed that their owners were far away from heat and toil; out through wide roads and green-hedged lanes where stately mansions set in flowers and mimic landscapes loomed far back from road in dignified seclusion, passing now and then a car of people who recognized Graham and bowed in the same deferential way as they had done in the tea room; and all the time his eyes were upon her, admiringly, delighting, and his care about her solicitous for her comfort. Once he halted the car and pointed off against the sunset, where wide gables and battlemented towers stood gray amidst a setting of green shrubbery and trees, and velvety lawns reached far to high trim hedges arched in places for an entrance to the beautiful estate. "That is my home over there," he said, and watched her widening eyes. "I wish I had time to take you over to night, but I know you are tired and ought to get home and rest. Another time we'll go around that way." And her heart leaped up as the car went forward again. There was to be another time, then. Ah! But she must not allow it. Her heart was far too foolish already. Yet she would enjoy this ride now she was started. They talked about the sunset and a poem he had lately read. He told her bits about his journey, referring to his experience at the mines, touching on some amusing incidents, sketching some of the queer characters he had met. Once he asked her quite abruptly if she thought her mother would be disturbed if he had a cement floor put in the basement of the barn sometime soon. He wanted to have it done before cold weather set in, and it would dry better now in the hot days. Of course, if it would be in the least disturbing to any of them it could wait, but he wanted to store a few things there that were being taken out of the office buildings, and he thought they would keep drier if there was a cement floor. When she said it would not disturb any one in the least, would on the contrary be quite interesting for the children to watch, she was sure, he went easily back to California scenery and never referred to it again. All through the ride, which was across a country she had never seen before and ended at Glenside approaching from a new direction, there was a subtle something between them, a sympathy and quick understanding, as if they were comrades, almost partners in a lot of common interests. Shirley chided herself for it every time she looked up and caught his glance, and felt the thrill of pleasure in this close companionship. Of course it was wholly in her own imagination, and due entirely to the nervous strain through which she had passed that day, she told herself. Of course he had nothing in his mind but the most ordinary kindly desire to give her a good time out of gratitude for what she had done for him. But nevertheless it was sweet, and Shirley was loath to surrender the joy of it while it lasted, dream though it might be. It lasted all the way, even up to the very stop in front of the barn when he took her hand to help her out, and his fingers lingered on hers with just an instant's pressure, sending a thrill to her heart again, and almost bringing tears to her eyes. Foolishness! She was overwrought. It was a shame that human beings were so made that they had to become weak like that in a time of pleasant rejoicing. The family came forth noisily to meet them, rejoicing openly at Graham's return, George and Harley vying with each other to shout the news about the garden and the chickens and the dovecote, Carol demanding to know where was Elizabeth, and Doris earnestly looking in his face and repeating, "Ittle birdie fly away, Mr. Graham, all gone. Oh, ittle birdies fly away." Even Mrs. Hollister came smiling to the door to meet him, and the young man had a warm word of hearty greeting and a handshake for each one. It was as if he had just got home to a place where he loved to be, and he could not show his joy enough. Shirley stood back for the moment, watching him, admiring the way his hair waved away from his temples, thinking how handsome he looked when he smiled, wondering that he could so easily fit himself into this group, which must in the nature of things be utterly different from his native element, rejoicing over the deference he paid to her plain quiet mother, thrilling over the kiss he gave her sweet little sister. Then Mrs. Hollister did something perfectly unexpected and dreadful. She invited him to stay to dinner. Shirley stood back and gasped. Of course he would decline, but think of the temerity of inviting the wealthy and cultured Mr. Graham to take dinner in his own barn. Oh, but he wasn't going to decline at all. He was accepting as if it were a great pleasure Mrs. Hollister were conferring upon him. Sure, he would stay. He had been wishing all the way out they would ask him. He had wondered whether he dared invite himself. Shirley, with her cheeks very red, hurried in to see that the tablecloth was put on straight, and look after one or two little things. But behold, he followed her out, and gently insisting and assisting, literally compelled her to come and lie down on the couch while he told the family what she had been through that day. Shirley was so happy she almost cried right there before them all. It was so wonderful to have someone take care of her that way. Of course it was only gratitude. But she had been taking care of other people so long that it completely broke her down to have someone take care of her. The dinner went much more easily than she had supposed it could with those cracked plates and the forks from which the silver was all worn off. Doris insisted that the guests sit next to her and butter her bread for her, and she occasionally caressed his coat sleeve with a sticky little hand, but he didn't seem to mind it in the least, and smiled down on her in quite a brotherly way, arranging her bib when it got tangled in her curls, and seeing that she had plenty of jelly on her bread. It was a beautiful dinner. Mother Hollister had known what she was about when she selected that particular night to invite unexpected company. There was stewed chicken on little round biscuits, with plenty of gravy and currant jelly, mashed potatoes, green peas, little new beets, and the most delicious custard pie for dessert, all rich velvety yellow with a golden brown top. The guest ate as if he enjoyed it, and asked for a second piece of pie, just as if he were one of them. It was unbelievable. He helped clear off the table, too, and insisted on Carol's giving him a wiping towel to help with the dishes. It was just like a dream. The young man tore himself reluctantly away about 9 o'clock and went home. But before he left he took Shirley's hand and looked into her eyes with another of those deep, understanding glances, and Shirley watched him whirling away in the moonlight, and wondered if there ever would be another day as beautiful and exciting and wonderful as this had been, and whether she could come down to sensible, everyday living again by morning. Then there was the story of the day to tell all over again after he was gone, and put in the little family touches that had been left out when the guest was there. And there was, oh, did you notice how admiring he looked when he told mother Shirley had a remarkably keen mind, and he said his father thought Shirley was the most unspoiled looking girl he had ever seen, and a lot of other things that Shirley hadn't heard before. Shirley told her mother what the senior Mr. Graham had said about giving her a reward, and her mother agreed that she had done just right in declining anything for so simple a service; but she looked after Shirley with a sigh as she went to put Doris to bed, and wondered if for this service the poor child was to get a broken heart. It could hardly be possible that a girl could be given much attention such as Shirley had received that day from as attractive a young man as Graham, without feeling it keenly not to have it continue. And of course it was out of the question that it should continue. Mrs. Hollister decided that she had done wrong to invite the young man to stay to supper, and resolved never to offend in that way again. It was a wrong to Shirley to put him on so intimate a footing in the household, and it could not but bring her sadness. He was a most unusual young man to have even wanted to stay, but one must not take that for more than a passing whim, and Shirley must be protected at all hazards. "Now," said the elder Graham the next morning when the business of the day was well under way and he had time to send for his son to come into his office, "now, I want you to tell me all about that little girl, and what you think we ought to give her. What did she mean by obligations yesterday? Have you been doing anything for her, son? I meant to ask you last night, but you came home so late I couldn't sit up." And then Sidney Graham told his father the whole story. It was different from telling his mother. He knew no barn would have the power to prejudice his father. "And you say that girl lives in the old barn?" exclaimed the father when the story was finished. "Why, the nervy little kid! And she looks as if she came out of a bandbox. Well, she's a bully little girl, and no mistake. Well, now, son, what can we do for her? We ought to do something pretty nice. You see, it wasn't just the money we might have lost. That would have been a mere trifle beside getting all those other folks balled up in the mess. Why, I'd have given every cent I owned before I'd have had Fuller and Browning and Barnett and Wilkes get entangled. I tell you, son, it was a great escape." "Yes, father, and it was a great lesson for me. I'll never be buncoed as easily again. But about Miss Hollister, I don't know what to say. She's very proud and sensitive. I had an awful time doing the little things I just had to do to that barn without her suspecting I was doing it especially for her. Father, you ought to go out there and meet the family, then you'd understand. They're not ordinary people. Their father was a college professor and wrote things. They're cultured people." "Well, I want to meet them. Why don't we go out there and call today? I think they must be worth knowing." So late that afternoon the father and son rode out to Glenside, and when Shirley and George reached home they found the car standing in front of their place, and the Grahams comfortably seated in the great open doorway, enjoying the late afternoon breeze, and seemingly perfectly at home in their own barn. "I'm not going to swarm here every day, Miss Shirley," said the son, rising and coming out to meet her. "You see, father hadn't heard about the transformation of the old barn, and the minute I told him about it he had to come right out and see it." "Yes," said the father, smiling contentedly, "I had to come and see what you'd done out here. I've played in the hay up in that loft many a day in my time, and I love the old barn. It's great to see it all fixed up so cozy. But we're going home now and let you have your dinner. We just waited to say howdy to you before we left." They stayed a few minutes longer, however, and the senior Graham talked with Shirley while he held Doris on his knee and stroked her silky hair, and she nestled in his arms quite content. Then, although young Graham was quite loath to leave so soon, they went, for he could not in conscience expect an invitation to dinner 2 days in succession. They rode away into the sunset, going across country to their home without going back to town, and Doris, as she stood with the others watching them away, murmured softly, "Nice father man, nice Graham father man." The nice Graham father man was at that moment remarking to his son in very decided tones as he turned to get a last glimpse of the old barn: "That old barn door ought to come down right away, Sid, and a nice big old fashioned door with glass around the sides made to fill the space. That door is an eyesore on the place, and they need a piazza. People like those can't live with a great door like that to open and shut every day." "Yes, father, I've thought of that, but I don't just know how to manage it. You see, they're not objects of charity. I've been thinking about some way to fix up a heating arrangement without hurting their feelings, so they could stay there all winter. I know they hate to go back to the city, and they're only paying $10 a month. It's all they can afford. What could they get in the city for that?" "Great Scott!
A girl like that living in a house she could get for $10, when some of these feather-brained baby dolls we know can't get on with less than 3 or 4 houses that cost from $50,000 to $100,000 apiece. Say, son, that's a peach of a girl. Do you know it? A peach of a girl. I've been talking with her, and she has a very superior mind." "I know she has, father," answered the son humbly. "I say, Sid, why don't you marry her? That would solve the whole problem. Then you could fix up the old barn into a regular house for her folks." "Well, father, that's just what I've made up my mind to do, if she'll have me," said the son with a gleam of triumph in his eyes. "Bully for you, Sid! Bully for you!" And the father gave his son's broad shoulder a resounding slap. "Why, Sid, I didn't think you had that much sense. Your mother gave me to understand that you were philandering around with that dolly faced Harriet Hale, and I couldn't see what you saw in her. But if you mean it, son, I'm with you every time. That girl's a peach, and you couldn't get a finer if you searched the world over." "Yes, I'm afraid mother's got her heart set on Harriet Hale," said the son dubiously, "but I can't see it that way." "Humph! Your mother likes show," sighed the father comically, "but she's got a good heart, and she'll bowl over all right and make the best of it. You know neither your mother nor I were such high and mighties when we were young, and we married for love. But now, if you really mean business, I don't see why we can't do something right away. When does that girl have her vacation? Of course she gets one sometime. Why couldn't your mother just invite the whole family to occupy the shore cottage for a little while? Get up some excuse or other. Ask him to take care of it. You know it's lying idle all this summer, and 2 servants down there growing fat with nothing to do. We might ship Elizabeth down there and let them be company for her. They seem like a fine set of children. It would do Elizabeth good to know them." "Oh, she's crazy about them. She's been out a number of times with me. And don't you remember she had Carol out to stay with her?" "Was that the black-eyed, sensible girl? Well, I declare! I didn't recognize her. She was all dolled up out at our house. I suppose Elizabeth loaned 'em to her, eh? Well, I'm glad. She's got sense, too. That's the kind of people I like my children to know. Now, if that vacation could only be arranged to come when your mother and I take that Western trip, why, it would be just the thing for Elizabeth. Work right all around. Now the thing for you to do is to find out about that vacation and begin to work things. Then you could have everything all planned and rush the work so it would be done by the time they came back." So the 2 conspirators plotted, while, all unconscious of their interest, Shirley was trying to get herself in hand and not think how Graham's eyes had looked when he said good night to her. CHAPTER XIX of the Enchanted Barn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Gail Mattern. The Enchanted Barn by Grace Livingston Hill. Chapter 19. Since the pastor from the village had called upon them, the young people of the stone barn had been identified with the little white church in the valley. Shirley had taken a class of boys in the Sunday school and was playing the organ, as George had once predicted. Carol was helping the primary teacher. George was assistant librarian and secretary. Harley was in Shirley's class, and Doris was one of the primaries. Shirley had at once identified herself with the struggling little Christian Endeavor Society, and was putting new life into it. With her enthusiasm, her new ideas about getting hold of the young people of the community, and her wonderful knack of getting the silent ones to take part in the meetings, she had suggested new committees, had invited the music committee to meet her at her home some evening to plan out special music, and to cooperate with the social committee in planning for music at the socials. She always carried a few appropriate clippings or neatly written verses or other quotations to meeting to slip into the hands of some who had not prepared to speak, and she saw to it that her brothers and sisters were always ready to say something. Withal, she did her part so unobtrusively that none of the old members could think she was trying to usurp power or make herself prominent. She became a quiet power behind the powers, to whom the president and all the other officers came for advice, and who always seemed ready to help in any work or to find a way out of any difficulty. Christian Endeavor in the little white church at once took great strides after the advent of the Hollisters, and even the idlers on the street corners were moved with curiosity to drop into the twilight service of the young people and see what went on, and why everybody seemed so interested. But the secret of it all, Shirley thought, was the little 5-minute prayer service that the prayer meeting committee held in the tiny primary room just before the regular meeting.
Shirley, as chairman of the prayer meeting committee, had started this little meeting, and she always came into the larger room with an exalted look upon her face and a feeling of strength in her heart from this brief speaking with her Master. Shirley was somewhat aghast the next Sabbath to have Sidney Graham arrive and ask her to take a ride with him. " Why, I was just going to church," she said, half hesitating, and then smiling bravely up at him. " Besides, I have a Sunday school class. I couldn't very well leave them, you know." He looked at her for a moment thoughtfully, trying to bridge in his thoughts this difference between them. Then he said quite humbly, " Will you take me with you?" "To church?" she asked, and there was a glad ring in her voice. Would he really go to church with her? " Yes, and to Sunday school if I may. I haven't been to Sunday school in years. I'd like to go if you'll only let me." Her cheeks grew rosy. She had a quick mental picture of putting him in Deacon Pettigrew's Bible class. " I'm afraid there isn't any class you would enjoy," she began with a troubled look. " It's only a little country church, you know. They don't have all the modern system, and very few teachers." " I should enjoy going into your class very much if I might." " Oh, mine are just boys, just little boys like Harley," said Shirley aghast. " I've been a little boy once, you know. I should enjoy it very much," said the applicant with satisfaction. " Oh, but I couldn't teach you." There was dismay in her voice. "Couldn't you, though? You've taught me more in the few months I've known you than I've learned in that many years from others. Try me. I'll be very good. I'll be a boy with the rest of them, and you can just forget I'm there and go ahead. I really am serious about it. I want to hear what you have to say to them." " Oh, I couldn't teach with you there !" exclaimed Shirley, putting her hands on her hot cheeks and looking like a frightened little child. " Indeed, I couldn't really. I'm not much of a teacher. I'm only a beginner. I shouldn't know how to talk before any but children." He watched her silently for a minute, his face grave with wistfulness. " Why do you teach them ?" he asked rather irrelevantly. " Because because I want to help them to live right lives. I want to teach them how to know God." "Why?" " So that they will be saved. Because it was Christ's command that his disciples should give the message. I am his disciple, so I have to tell the message." "Was there any special stipulation as to whom that message should be given?" asked the young man thoughtfully. " Did he say you were just to give it to those boys?" " Why, no. It was to be given to all the world, every creature." Shirley spoke the words hesitatingly, a dimple beginning to show in her cheeks as her eyelids drooped over her shy eyes. " And don't I come in on that?" asked Graham with a twinkle that reminded Shirley of his father. Shirley had to laugh shamefacedly then. " But I couldn't," said Shirley. " I'd be so scared I couldn't think of a thing to say." " You're not afraid of me, Miss Shirley. You wouldn't be scared if you thought I really needed to know the message, would you? Well, I really do, as much as any of those kids." Shirley looked steadily into his earnest eyes and saw something there that steadied her nerve. The laughter died out of her own eyes, and a beautiful light of longing came into them. " All right," she said with a little lift of her chin, as if girding up her strength to the task. " You may come, and I will do the best that I can, but I'm afraid it will be a poor best. I've only a little story to tell them this morning." " Please give them just what you had intended. I want the real thing just as a boy would get it from you. Will the rest of them come in the car with us?" Shirley was very quiet during the ride to church. She let the rest do all the talking, and she sat looking off at the woods and praying for help, trying to calm the flutter of her frightened heart, trying to steady her nerves and brace herself to teach the lesson just as she had intended to teach it. She watched him furtively during the opening exercises, the untrained singing, the monotonous prayer of an old farmer elder, the dry platitudes of the illiterate superintendent; but he sat respectfully listening, taking it all for what it was worth, the best service these people knew how to render to their Maker. Somehow her heart had gained the strength she needed from the praise she breathed continually, and when the time for teaching the lesson arrived she came to her class with quietness. There was a little awe upon the boys because of the stranger in their midst. They did not fling the hymn books down with a noisy thud, nor send the lesson leaves flying like winged darts across the room quite so much as they were wont to do. They looked askance at Harley, who sat proudly by the visitor, supplying him with Bibles, hymn books, lesson leaves, and finding the place for him officiously. But Graham sat among the boys without ostentation, and made as little of his own presence as possible. He smiled at them now and then, put a handful of silver into the collection envelope when they would have passed him by, and promised a ride to one fellow who ventured to ask him hoarsely if that was his car outside the church. Shirley had made up her mind to to forget as far as she could the presence of the visitor in the class, and to this end she fixed her eyes upon the worst little boy present, the boy who got up all the disturbances and made all the noises, and was the most adorable, homely, sturdy young imp the Valley Church could produce. He sat straight across from her, while Graham was at the side, and she could see in Jack's eye that he meant mischief if he could overcome his awe of the stranger. So, before Jack could possibly get started, she began her story, and told it straight to Jack, never taking her eyes from his face from start to finish, and before she was halfway through she had her little audience enthralled. It was a story of the Bible told in modern setting, and told straight to the heart of a boy who was the counterpart in his own soul of the man whom Christ cured and forgave. What Graham was thinking or looking Shirley did not know. She had literally forgotten his existence after the first few minutes. She had seen the gleam of interest in the eyes of the boy Jack. She knew that her message was going home to a convicted young soul, and that he saw himself in his own childish sins in the sinful life of the hero of her tale. Her whole soul was bent on making him see the Saviour who could make that young life over. Not until the story was almost finished did any one of the listeners, unless perhaps Harley, who was used to such story recitals, have a suspicion that the story was just a plain, ordinary chapter out of the Bible. Then suddenly one of the elder boys broke forth: "Aw, gee! That's just the man in the Bible let down through the roof." There was a slight stir in the class at the discovery as it dawned upon them that the teacher had "put one over on them" again, but the interest for the most part was sustained breathlessly until the superintendent's bell rang, and the heads drew together in an absorbed group around her for the last few sentences, spoken in a lower tone because the general hum of teaching in the room had ceased. Graham's face was very grave and thoughtful as she finished, and slipped away from them to take her place at the little organ. One could see that it was not in the teacher alone, but in her message as well, that he was interested. The boys all had that subdued, half ashamed, half defiant look that boys have when they have been caught looking serious. Each boy frowned and studied his toes, or hunted assiduously in his hymn book to hide his confusion, and the class in various keys lifted up assertive young voices vigorously in the last hymn. Graham sat beside Shirley in the little crowded church during the rather monotonous service. The regular pastor, who was a good spiritual man, if not a brilliant one, and gave his congregation solid, practical sermons, was on his vacation, and the pulpit was supplied by a young theologue who was so new to his work that his sermon was a rather involved effort. But so strong was the power of the Sunday school lesson to which he had just listened that Graham felt as if he were sitting in some hallowed atmosphere. He did not see the red-faced, embarrassed young preacher, nor notice his struggles to bring forth his message bravely. He saw only the earnest-faced young teacher as she spoke the words of life to her boys, saw the young imp faces of her boys softened and touched by the story she told, saw that she really believed and felt every word she spoke, and knew that there was something in it all that he wanted. The seat was crowded and the day was warm, but the two who looked over the same hymn book did not notice it. The soft air came in from the open window beside them, breathing sweet clover and wild honeysuckle, and the meadow larks sang their songs and made it seem just a little bit of heaven. Shirley's muslin frills trembled against Graham's hand as she reached to catch a fluttering leaf of the hymn book that the wind had caught, once her hand had brushed the coat sleeve beside her as they turned the page, and she felt the soft texture of the fine dark blue goods with a pleasant sense of the beautiful and fitting. It thrilled her to think he was standing thus beside her in her own little church, yielding himself to the same worship with her in the little common country congregation. It was wonderful, beautiful, and to have come to her. She glanced shyly up at him, so handsome, standing there singing, his hand almost touching hers holding the book. He felt her glance and answered it with a look and smile, their eyes holding each other for just the fraction of a second in which some inner thought was interchanged, some question asked and answered by the invisible flash of heartbeats, a mutual joining in the spiritual service, and then, half frightened, Shirley dropped her eyes to the page, and the soft roses stole into her cheeks again. She felt as if she had seen something in his eyes and acknowledged it in her own, as if she had inadvertently shown him her heart in that glance, and that heart of hers was leaping and bounding with an uncontrollable joy, while her conscience sought by every effort to get it in control. What nonsense, it said, what utter folly to make so much of his coming to church with her once. to allow her soul to get into such a flutter over a man who had no more idea of noticing her or caring for her than he had for a bird on the tree. And with all the tumult in her heart she did not even see the envious glances of the village maidens, who stared and stared with all their might at the handsome man who came to church in an expensive car and brought the girl who lived in a barn. Shirley's social position went up several notches, and she never even knew it. In fact, she was becoming a great puzzle to the residents of Glenside. It was good to know that for once the shabby collection box of the little church was borne back to the altar laden with a goodly bill, put in with so little ostentation that one might have judged it but a penny, looking on, though even a penny would have made more noise in the unlined wood box. After the service was over, Graham went out with the children, while Shirley lingered to play over an accompaniment for a girl who was going to sing at the vesper service that afternoon. He piled all the children in the back seat of the car, put the boy he had promised to ride in the seat beside him, took a spin around the streets, and was back in front of the church by the time Shirley came out. Then that foolish heart of hers had to leap again at the thought that he had saved the front seat for her. The boy descended as if he had been caught up into heaven for a brief space and would never forget it the rest of his life. There was that same steady look of trust and understanding in Graham's eyes whenever he looked at her on the way home, and once while the children were talking together in the back seat he leaned toward her and said in a low tone: "I wonder if you will let me take you away for a little while this afternoon to a quiet place I know where there is a beautiful view, and let us sit and talk. There are some things I want to ask you about what you said this morning. I was very much interested in it all, and I'm deeply grateful that you let me go. Now, will you go with me? I'll bring you back in time for the Christian Endeavor service, and you see in the meantime I'm inviting myself to dinner. Do you think your mother will object?" What was there for Shirley to do but accept this alluring invitation? She did not believe in going off on pleasure excursions on the Sabbath, but this request that she ride to a quiet place out of doors for a religious talk could not offend her strongest sense of what was right on the Sabbath day. And surely, if the Lord had a message for her to bear, she must bear it to whomsoever he sent. This, then, was this man's interest in her, that she had been able to make him think of God. A glad elation filled her heart. Something deep and true stirred within her and lifted her above the thought of self like a blessing from on high. To be asked to bring light to a soul like this one, this was honor indeed. This was an answer to her prayer of the morning, that she might fulfill God's pleasure with the lesson of the day. The message then had reached his soul. It was enough. She would think no more of self. Yet whenever she looked at him and met that smile again she was thrilled with joy in spite of herself. At least there was a friendliness here beyond the common acquaintance, a something that was true, deep, lasting, even though worlds should separate them in the future, a something built on a deep understanding, sympathy, and common interests. Well, so be it. She would rejoice that it had been given to her to know one man of the world in this beautiful way, and her foolish little human heart should understand what a high, true thing this was that must not be misunderstood. So she reasoned with herself, and watched him during the dinner among the children, out in the yard among the flowers and animals. Everywhere he seemed so fine and splendid, so far above all other men that she had ever met, and her mother watching trembled for her when she saw her happy face. "Do you think you ought to go with him, daughter?" she asked with troubled eyes when they were left alone for a moment after dinner. "You know it is the Sabbath, and you know his life is very different from ours." "Mother, he wants to talk about the Sunday school lesson this morning," said Shirley shyly. "I guess he's troubled perhaps, and wants me to help him. I guess he has never thought much about religious things." "Well, daughter dear, be careful. Do all you can for him, of course, but remember, don't let your heart stray out of your keeping. He is very attractive, dear, and very unconventional for a wealthy man. I think he is true and wouldn't mean to trifle, but he wouldn't realize." "I know, mother. Don't you be afraid for me," said Shirley with a lofty look, half of exultation, half of proud self-command. He took her to a mossy place beside a little stream, where the light filtered down through the lacy leaves flecking the bank, and braided golden currents in the water, with green and purple hazy hills in the distance, and just enough seclusion for a talk without being too far away from the world. "My little sister says that you people have a real God," he said when she was comfortably fixed with cushions from the car at her back against a tall tree trunk. "She says you seem to realize his presence. I don't know just how to say it, but I'd like to know if this is so. I'd like to know what makes you different from other girls, and your home different from most of the homes I know. I'd like to know if I may have it too." That was the beginning. Shirley, shy as a bird at first, having never spoken on such subjects except to children, yet being well versed in the Scriptures, and feeling her faith with every atom of her being, drew out her little Bible that she had slipped into her pocket when they started, and plunged into the great subject. Never had preacher more earnest listener, or more lovely temple in which to preach. And if sometimes the young man's thoughts for a few moments strayed from the subject to rest his eyes in tenderness upon the lovely face of the young teacher, and longed to draw her into his arms and claim her for his own, he might well have been forgiven. For Shirley was very fair, with the light of other worlds in her face, her eyes all sparkling with her eagerness, her lips aglow with words that seemed to be given her for the occasion. She taught him simply, not trying to go into deep arguments, but urging the only way she knew, the way of taking Christ's promise on its face value, the way of being willing to do his will, trusting it to him to reveal himself, and the truth of the doctrine, and make the believer sure. They talked until the sun sank low, and the calling of the woodbirds warned them that the Endeavor hour was near. Before they left the place he asked her for the little Bible, and she laid it in his hand with joy that he wanted it, that she was chosen to give him a gift so precious. "It's all marked up," she said apologetically. "I always mark the verses I love, or have had some special experience with." "It will be that more precious to me," he said gently, fingering the leaves reverently, and then he looked up and gave her one of those deep looks that seemed to say so much to her heart. And all at once she realized that she was on earth once more, and that his presence and his look were very precious to her. Her cheeks grew pink with the joy of it, and she looked down in confusion and could not answer, so she rose to her feet. But he, springing at once to help her up, kept her hand for just an instant with earnest pressure, and said in deeply moved tones: "You don't know what you have done for me this afternoon, my friend." He waited with her hand in his an instant, as if he were going to say more, but had decided it were better not. The silence was so compelling that she looked up into his eyes, meeting his smile, and that said so many things her heart went into a tumult again, and could not quite come to itself all through the Christian Endeavor service. On the way home from the church he talked a little about her vacation, when it came, how long it lasted, what she would do with it. Just as they reached home he said, "I hope you will pray for me, my friend." There was something wonderful in the way he said that word "friend." It thrilled her through and through as she stood beside the road and watched him speed away into the evening. "My friend! I hope you will pray for me, my friend." It sang a glory song down in her heart as she turned to go in with the vivid glory of the sunset on her face. CHAPTER XX of the Enchanted Barn. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by Gail Mattern. The Enchanted Barn by Grace Livingston Hill. Chapter 20. The cement floor had been down a week and was as hard as a rock when one day 2 or 3 wagon loads of things arrived with a note from Graham to Mrs. Hollister to say that he would be glad if these might be stored in one corner of the basement floor where they would be out of her way and not take up too much room. Harley and George went down to look them over that evening. "He said something about some things being taken from the office building," said Harley, kicking a pile of iron pipes with his toe. "These don't look like any old things that have been used," said George thoughtfully. "They look perfectly new." Then he studied them a few minutes more from another angle and shut his lips judiciously. He belonged to the boy species that has learned to "shut up and saw wood," whatever that expression may mean. If anything was to come out of that pile of iron in the future, he did not mean to break confidence with anybody's secrets. He walked away whistling and said nothing further about them. The next day Mrs. Graham came down upon the Hollisters in her limousine and an exquisite toilet of organdie and ribbons. She was attended by Elizabeth, wild with delight over getting home again. She begged Mrs. Hollister very charmingly and sincerely to take care of Elizabeth for 3 or 4 weeks while she and her husband were away, and to take her entire family down to the shore and occupy their cottage, which had been closed all summer and needed opening and airing. She said that nothing would please Elizabeth so much as to have them all her guests during September. The maids were there with nothing to do but look after them, and would just love to serve them. It really would be a great favor to her if she could know that Elizabeth was getting a little salt air under such favorable conditions. She was so genuine in her request, and suggested so earnestly that Shirley and George needed the change during their vacation, and could just as well come down every night and go up every morning for a week or two more after the vacations were over, that Mrs. Hollister actually promised to consider it and talk it over with Shirley when she came home. Elizabeth and Carol nearly went into spasms of joy over the thought of all they could do down at the shore together. When Shirley came home she found the whole family quite upset discussing the matter. Carol had brought out all the family wardrobe and was showing how she could wash this and dye that, and turn this skirt upside down and put a piece from the old waist in there to make the lower part flare, and Harley was telling how he could get the man next door to look after the hens and pigeons, and there was nothing needing much attention in the garden now, for the corn was about over except the last picking, which wasn't ripe yet. Mrs. Hollister was saying that they ought really to stay at home and look up another place to live during the winter, and Carol was pleading that another place would be easier found when the weather was cooler anyway, and that Shirley was just awfully tired and needed a change. Supper was flung onto the table that night any way it happened, for they were all too excited to know what they were about. Carol got butter twice and forgot to cut the bread, and Harley poured milk into the already filled water pitcher. They were even too excited to eat. Graham arrived with Elizabeth early in the evening to add his pleading to his mother's, and before he left he had about succeeded in getting Mrs. Hollister's promise that she would go. Shirley's vacation began the 1st of September, and George had asked for his at the same time so that they could enjoy it together. Each had 2 weeks. Graham said that the cost of going back and forth to the city for the two would be very little. By the next morning they had begun to say what they would take along and to plan what they would do with the dog. It was very exciting. There was only a week to get ready, and Carol wanted to make bathing suits for everyone. Graham came again that night with more suggestions. There were plenty of bathing suits down at the cottage of all sizes and kinds. No need to make bathing suits. The dog, of course, was to go along. He needed the change as much as anybody, and they needed him there. That breed of dog was a great swimmer. He would take care of the children when they went in bathing. How would Mrs. Hollister like to have one of the old Graham servants come over to sleep at the barn and look after things while they were gone? The man had really nothing to do at home while everybody was away, as the whole corps of servants would be there, and this one would enjoy coming out to the country. He had a brother living on a place about a mile away. As for the trip down there, Graham would love to take them all in the big touring car with Elizabeth. He had been intending to take her down that way, and there was no reason in the world why they should not all go along. They would start Saturday afternoon, as soon as Shirley and George were free, and be down before bedtime. It would be cool and delightful journeying at that hour, and a great deal pleasanter than the train. So one by one the obstructions and hindrances were removed from their path, and it was decided that the Hollisters were to go to the seashore. At last the day came. Shirley and George went off in the morning shouting last directions about things. They were always having to go to their work, whatever was happening. It was sometimes hard on them, particularly this day when everything was so delightfully exciting. The old Graham servant arrived about 3:00 in the afternoon, and proved himself invaluable in doing the little last things without being told. Mrs. Hollister had her first gleam of an idea of what it must be to have plenty of perfectly trained servants about to anticipate one's needs. He entered the barn as if barns were his native heath, and moved about with the ease and unobtrusiveness that marks a perfect servant, but with none of the hauteur and disdain that many of those individuals entertain toward all whom they consider poor or beneath them in any way. He had a kindly face, and seemed to understand just exactly what was to be done. Things somehow moved more smoothly after he arrived. At 4:00 came Graham with the car and a load of long linen dust cloaks and veils. The Hollisters donned them and bestowed themselves where they were told. The servants stowed away the wraps and suitcases. Star mounted the seat beside Harley, and they were ready. They turned to look back at the barn as the car started. The old servant was having a little trouble with the big door, trying to shut it. " That door is a nuisance," said Graham as they swept away from the curb. " It must be fixed. It is no fit door for a barn, anyway." Then they curved up around Allister Avenue and left the barn far out of sight. They were going across country to the Graham home to pick up Elizabeth. It was a wonderful experience for them, that beautiful ride in the late afternoon, and when they swept into the great gates and up the broad drive to the Graham mansion and stopped under the porte cochere, Mrs. Hollister was quite overcome with the idea of being beholden to people who lived in such grandeur as this. To think she had actually invited their son to dine in a barn with her! Elizabeth came rushing out eagerly, all ready to start, and climbed in beside Carol. Even George, who was usually silent when she was about, gave her a grin of welcome. The father and mother came out to say good by, gave them good wishes, and declared they were perfectly happy to leave their daughter in such good hands. Then the car curved about the great house, among tennis courts, greenhouses, garage, stable, and what not, and back to the pike again, leaping out upon the perfect road, as if it were as excited as the children. Two more stops to pick up George, who was getting off early, and Shirley, who was through at 5 o'clock, and then they threaded their way out of the city, across the ferry, through another city, and out into the open country dotted all along the way with clean, pretty little towns. They reached a lovely grove at sundown, and stopped by the way to have supper. Graham got down and made George help him get out the big hamper. There was a most delectable lunch. Sandwiches of delicate and unknown condiments, salad as bewildering, soup that had been kept hot in a thermos bottle, served in tiny white cups, iced tea and ice cream meringues from another thermos compartment, and plenty of delicious little cakes, olives, nuts, bonbons, and fruit. It seemed a wonderful supper to them all, eaten out there under the trees, with the birds beginning their vesper songs, and the stars peeping out slyly. Then they packed up their dishes and hurried on their beautiful way, a silver thread of a moon coming out to make the scene more lovely. Doris was almost asleep when at last they began to hear the booming of the sea and smell the salt breeze as it swept back inland. But she roused up and opened wide, mysterious eyes, peering into the new darkness and murmuring softly: "I want to see the ocean. I want to see the great big water." Stiff, bewildered, filled with ecstasy, they finally unloaded in front of a big white building that looked like a hotel. They tried to see into the deep, mysterious darkness across the road, where boomed a great voice that called them, and where dashing spray loomed high like a waving phantom hand to beckon them now and again, and far moving lights told of ships and a world beyond the one they knew, a wide, limitless thing like eternity, universe, chaos. With half reluctant feet they turned away from the mysterious unseen lure and let themselves be led across an unbelievably wide veranda into the bright light of a hall where everything was clean and shining, and a great fireplace filled with friendly flames gave cheer and welcome. The children stood bewildered in the brightness while two strange serving maids unfastened their wraps and dust cloaks and helped them take off their hats. Then they all sat around the fire, for Graham had come in by this time, and the maids brought trays of some delicious drink with little cakes and crackers and tinkling ice and straws to drink with. Doris almost fell asleep again, and was carried upstairs by Shirley and put to bed in a pretty white crib she was too sleepy to look at, while Carol, Elizabeth, George, and Harley went with Graham across the road to look at the black, yawning cavern they called ocean, and to have the shore lighthouses pointed out to them and named one by one. They were all asleep at last, a little before midnight, in spite of the excitement over the spacious rooms and who should have which. Think of it! 30 rooms in the house, and every one as pretty as every other one. What luxury! And nobody to occupy them but themselves. Carol could hardly get to sleep. She felt as if she had dropped into a novel and was living it. When Graham came out of his room the next morning the salt breeze swept invitingly through the hall and showed him the big front door of the upper piazza open and someone standing in the sunlight with light glowing garments gazing at the sea in rapt enjoyment. Coming out softly, he saw that it was Shirley dressed in white, with a ribbon of blue at her waist and a soft pink color in her cheeks, looking off to sea. He stood for a moment to enjoy the picture, and said in his heart that sometime, if he got his wish, he would have her painted so by some great artist, with just that little simple white dress and blue ribbon, her round white arm lifted, her small hand shading her eyes, the sunlight burnishing her brown hair into gold. He could scarcely refrain from going to her and telling her how beautiful she was. But when he stepped quietly up beside her only his eyes spoke, and brought the color deeper into her cheeks. And so they stood for some minutes looking together and drawing in the wonder of God's sea. "This is the first time I've seen it, you know," spoke Shirley at last, "and I'm so glad it was on Sunday morning. It will always make the day seem more holy and the sea more wonderful to think about. I like best things to happen on Sunday, don't you? Because that is the best day of all." Graham looked at the sparkling sea, all azure and pearls, realized the Sabbath quiet, and marvelled at the beauty of the soul of the girl, even as her feeling about it all seemed to enter into and become a part of himself. "Yes, I do," said he. "I never did before, but I do now. And always shall," he added under his breath. That was almost as wonderful a Sabbath as the one they had spent in the woods a couple of weeks before. They walked and talked by the sea, and they went to a little Episcopal chapel where the windows stood open for the chanting of the waves and the salt of the breeze to come in freely, and then they went out and walked by the sea again. Wherever they went, whether resting in some of the many big rockers on the broad verandas, or walking on the hard smooth sand, or sitting in some cozy nook by the waves, they felt the same deep sympathy, the same conviction that their thoughts were one, the same wonderful thrill of the day and each other's nearness. Somehow in this new environment Shirley forgot for a little that this young man was not of her world, that he was probably going back soon to the city to enter into a whirl of the winter season in society, that other girls would claim his smiles and attentions, and she would likely be forgotten. She lost the sense of it entirely, and companioned with him as joyously as if there had never been anything to separate them. Her mother, looking on, sighed, feared, smiled, and sighed again. They walked together in the sweet darkness beside the waves that evening, and he told her how when he was a little boy he wanted to climb up to the stars and find God, but later how he thought the stars and God were myths, like Santa Claus, and that the stars were only electric lights put up by men and lighted from a great switch every night, and when they didn't shine somebody had forgotten to light them. He told her many things about himself that he had never told to any one before, and she opened her shy heart to him, too. Then they planned what they would do next week when he came back. He told her he must go back to the city in the morning to see his father and mother off, and attend to a few matters of business at the office. It might be 2 or 3 days before he could return, but after that he was coming down to take a little vacation himself if she didn't mind, and they would do a lot of delightful things together, row, fish, go crabbing, and he would teach her to swim, and show her all the walks and favorite places where he used to go as a boy. Reluctantly they went in, his fingers lingering about hers for just a second at the door, vibrating those mysterious heartstrings of hers again, swiping dearest music from them, and frightening her with joy that took her half the night to put down. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of The Enchanted Barn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Gail Mattern. The Enchanted Barn by Grace Livingston Hill. Chapter 21. Sidney Graham went back to the city the next morning. They all stood out on the piazza to watch the big car glide away. Doris stood on the railing of the piazza with Shirley's arm securely about her, and waved a little fat hand. Then, with a pucker of her lip, she demanded, "Vy does my Mr. Dwaham do way? I don't yant him to do way. I yant him to stay wif me always. Don't oo, Shirley?" Shirley, with glowing cheeks, turned from watching the retreating car and put her little sister down on the floor suddenly. "Run and get your hat, Doris, and we'll take a walk on the sand," she said, smiling alluringly at the child, till the baby forgot her grievance and beamed out with answering smiles. That was a wonderful day. They all took a walk on the sand first, George pushing his mother in a big wheeled chair belonging to the cottage. Elizabeth was guide and pointed out all the beauties of the place, telling eager bits of reminiscence from her childhood memories, to which even George listened attentively. From having been only tolerant of her, George had now come to look upon Elizabeth as a good scout. When Mrs. Hollister grew tired they took her back to the cottage and established her in a big chair with a book. Then they all rushed off to the bathhouses and presently emerged in bathing suits, Doris looking like a little sprite in her scarlet flannel scrap of a suit, her bright hair streaming, and her beautiful baby arms and legs flashing white like a cherub's in the sunlight. They came back from their dip in the wave, hungry and eager to the wonderful dinner that was served so exquisitely in the great cool dining room, from the windows of which they could watch the lazy ships sailing in the offing. Doris fell asleep over her dessert and was tumbled into the hammock to finish her nap. Carol and Elizabeth and the boys started off crabbing, and Shirley settled herself in another hammock with a pile of new magazines about her, and prepared to enjoy a whole afternoon of laziness. It was so wonderful to lie still, at leisure and unhurried, with all those lovely magazines to read and nothing to disturb her. She leaned her head back and closed her eyes for a minute, just to listen to the sea and realize how good it was to be here. Back in her mind there was a pleasant consciousness of the beautiful yesterday and the beautiful to morrows that might come when Sidney Graham returned, but she would not let her heart dwell upon them. That would be humoring herself too much, and perhaps give her a false idea of things. She simply would not let this wonderful holiday be spoiled by the thought that it would have to end some day, and that she would be back at the old routine of care and worry once more. She was roused from her reverie by the step of the postman bringing a single letter for her. It was addressed in an unknown hand and was in a fat long envelope. Wonderingly she opened it and found inside a bank book and blank check book with a little note on which was written: Dear little girl, this is just a trifle of that present we were talking about the other day that belongs to you. It isn't all by any means, but we'll see to the rest later. Spend this on chocolates or chewing gum or frills or whatever you like, and have a good time down at the shore. You're a bully little girl and deserve everything nice that's going. Don't be too serious, Miss Shirley. Play a little more. Your elderly friend, Walter K. Graham. In the bank book was an entry of $5,000 on check account. Shirley held her breath and stared at the figures with wide eyes, then slipped away and locked herself in the big white room that was hers. Kneeling down by the bed, she cried and prayed and smiled all in one, and thanked the Lord for making people so kind to her. After that she went to find her mother. Mrs. Hollister was sitting on the wide upper piazza in a steamer chair looking off to sea and drawing in new life at every breath. Her book was open on her lap, but she had forgotten to read in the joy of all that was about her. To tell the truth, she was wondering if the dear father who was gone from them knew of their happy estate, and thinking how glad he would be for them if he did. She read the letter twice before she looked at the bank book with its astonishing figures, and heard again Shirley's tale of the happening in the office the morning of the arrest. Then she read the letter once more. "I'm just not sure, daughter," she said at last with a smile, "what we ought to do about this. Are you?" "No," said Shirley, smiling. "I suppose I'll give it back. But wasn't it wonderful of him to do it? Isn't it grand that there are such men in the world?" "It certainly is, dear, and I'm glad my little girl was able to do something that was of assistance to him, and that she has won her way into his good graces so simply and sweetly. But I'm not so sure what you ought to do. Hadn't we better pray about it a bit before you decide? How soon ought you to write to him? It's too late to reach him before he leaves for California, isn't it?" "Oh, yes, he's just about starting now," said the girl. "Don't you suppose he planned it so that I couldn't answer right away? I don't know his address. I can't do a thing till I find out where to write. I wouldn't like to send it to the office because they would probably think it was business, and his secretary might open it." "Of course. Then we'll just pray about it, shall we, dear? I'm not just sure in my mind whether it's well meant bit of charity that we ought to hand back with sincere thanks, or whether it's God's way of rewarding my little girl for her faithfulness and quickness of action. Our Father knows we have been and still are in a hard place. He knows that we have need of all these things that money has to buy. You really did a good thing and saved Mr. Graham from great loss, you know, and perhaps he is the kind of man who would feel a great deal happier if he shared a little of it with you, was able to make some return for what you did for him. However, $5,000 is a great deal of money for a brief service. What do you think, dear?" "I don't know, mother dear. I'm all muddled, just as you say, but I guess it will come right if we pray about it. Anyhow, I'm going to be happy over his thinking of me, whether I keep it or not." Shirley went thoughtfully back to her hammock and her magazines, a smile on her lips, a dream in her eyes. She found herself wondering whether Sidney Graham knew about this money, and what he would wish her to do about it. Then suddenly she cast the whole question from her and plunged into her magazine, wondering why it was that almost any question that came into her mind promptly got around and entangled itself with Mr. Sidney Graham. What did he have to do with it, anyway? The magazine story was very interesting, and Shirley soon forgot everything else in the pleasure of surrendering herself to the printed page. An hour went by, another passed, and Shirley was still oblivious to all about her. Suddenly she became aware of a boy on a bicycle, riding almost up to the very steps and whistling vigorously. " Miss Shirley Hollister here ?" he demanded as he alighted on one foot on the lower step, the other foot poised for flight as soon as his errand should have been performed. " Why, yes," said Shirley, startled, struggling to her feet and letting a shower of magazines fall all about her. " Long distance wants yer," he announced, looking her over apathetically. " Mr. Barnard of Philadelphia wants to talk to yer." And with the final word chanted nasally he alighted upon his obedient steed and spun away down the walk again. " But wait ! Where shall I go ? Where is the telephone ?"" Pay station !" shouted the impervious child, turning his head over his shoulder. " Drug store 2 blocks from the post office." Without waiting to go upstairs, Shirley, whose training had been to answer the telephone at once, caught up Elizabeth's parasol that lay on a settee by the door, rumpled her fingers through her hair by way of toilet, and hurried down the steps in the direction the boy had disappeared, wondering what in the world Mr. Barnard could want of her. Was he going to call her back from her vacation? Was this perhaps the only day she would have, this and yesterday? There would always be yesterday. With a sigh she looked wistfully at the sea. If she had known a summons was to come so soon she would not have wasted a second on magazines. She would have sat and gazed all afternoon at the sea. If Mr. Barnard wanted her, of course she would have to go. Business was business, and she couldn't afford to lose her job even with that fairy dream of $5,000 to her credit in the bank. She knew, of course, she meant to give that back. It was hers for the day, but it could not become tangible. It was beautiful, but it was right that it must go back, and if her employer felt he must cut short her vacation, why, of course, she must acquiesce and just be glad she had had this much. Perhaps it was just as well, anyway, for if Sidney Graham came down and spent a few days there was no knowing what foolish notions her heart would take, jumping and careening the way it had been doing lately when he just looked at her. Yes, she would go back if Mr. Barnard wanted her. It was the best thing she could do, though perhaps he would only be calling her to ask where she had left something for which they were searching. That stupid Ashton girl who took her place might not have remembered all her directions. Breathless, with possibilities crowding upon her mind, she hurried into the drug store and sought the telephone booth. It seemed ages before the connection was made and she heard Mr. Barnard's dry, familiar tones over the phone. "That you, Miss Hollister? This is Mr. Barnard. I'm sorry to disturb you right in the midst of your holiday, but a matter has come up that is rather serious, and I'm wondering if you could help us out for a day or two. If you would, we'd be glad to give you $50 for the extra time and let you extend your vacation to a month instead of 2 weeks. Do you think you could spare a day or two to help us right away?" " Oh, why, yes, of course," faltered Shirley, her eyes dancing at the thought of the extra vacation and money. " Thank you. I was sure you would," said Mr. Barnard with relief in his voice. " You see, we have got that government contract. The news just came in the afternoon mail. It's rather particular business because it has to do with matters that the government wishes to keep secret. I am to go down to morrow morning to Washington to receive instructions, and I have permission to bring a trusted private secretary with me. Now you know, of course, that I couldn't take Miss Ashton. She wouldn't be able to do what I want done, even if she were one I could trust not to say a word about the matter. I would take Jim Thorpe, but his father has just died, and I can't very well ask him to leave. Neither can I delay longer than to morrow. Now the question is, would you be willing to go to Washington in the morning? I have looked up the trains, and I find you can leave the shore at 8:10 and meet me in Baltimore at 10 o'clock. I will be waiting for you at the train gate, but in case we miss each other wait in the station close to the telephone booths till I find you. We will take the next train for Washington and be there a little before noon. If all goes well we ought to be through our business in plenty of time to make a 4 o'clock train home. Of course there may be delays, and it is quite possible you might have to remain in Washington overnight, though I hardly think so. But in case you do, I will see that you are safe and comfortable in a quiet hotel near the station, where my wife's sister is staying this summer. Of course your expenses will all be paid. I will telegraph and have a mileage book put at your disposal that you can call for right there in your station in the morning. Are you willing to undertake this for us? I assure you we shall not forget the service." When Shirley finally hung up the receiver and looked about the little country drug store in wonder at herself, the very bottles on the shelves seemed to be whirling and dancing about before her eyes. What strange, exciting things were happening to her all in such breathless haste. Only one day at the shore and a piece of another, and here she was with a trip to Washington on her hands. It certainly was bewildering to have things come in such rapid succession. She wished it had come at another time, and not just now when she had not yet got used to the great sea and the wonder of the beautiful place where they were staying. She did not want to be interrupted just yet. It would not be quite the same when she got back to it, she was afraid. But of course she could not refuse. It never entered her head to refuse. She knew enough about the office to realize that Mr. Barnard must have her. Jimmie Thorpe would have been the one to go if he were available, because he was a man and had been with Barnard and Clegg for 10 years and knew all their most confidential business. But of course Jimmie could not go with his father lying dead and his mother and invalid sister needing him, and there was no one else but herself. She thought it all out on the way back to the cottage, with a little pang at the thought of losing the next day and of having perhaps to stay over in Washington a day and maybe miss the arrival of Sidney Graham if he should come in a day or two as he had promised. He might even come and go back again before she was able to return, and perhaps he would think her ungrateful to leave when he had been so kind to plan all this lovely vacation for her pleasure. Then she brought herself up smartly and told herself decidedly that it was nothing to him whether she was there or not, and it certainly had no right to be anything to her. It was a good thing she was going, and would probably be a good thing for all concerned if she stayed until he went back to the city again. With this firm determination she hurried up to the veranda where her mother sat with Doris and told her story. Mrs. Hollister looked troubled. " I'm sorry you gave him an answer, Shirley, without waiting to talk it over with me. I don't believe I like the idea of your going to a strange city all alone that way. Of course, Mr. Barnard will look after you in a way, but still he's a good deal of a stranger. I do wish he had let you alone for your vacation. It seems as if he might have found somebody else to go. I wish Mr. Graham was here. I shouldn't wonder if he would suggest some way out of it for you." But Shirley stiffened into dignity at once. " Really, mother dear, I'm sure I don't see what Mr. Graham would have to say about it if he were here. I shouldn't ask his advice. You see, mother, really there isn't anybody else that could do this but Jimmie Thorpe, and he's out of the question. It would be unthinkable that I should refuse in this emergency, and you know Mr. Barnard has been very kind. Besides, think of the ducky vacation I'll have afterward, a whole month, and all that extra money. That shall go to the rent of a better house for winter. Think of it! Don't you worry, mother dear. There isn't a thing in the world could happen to me. I'll be the very most discreetest person you ever heard of. I'll even glance shyly at the White House and Capitol. Come, let's go up and get dolled up for supper. Won't the children be surprised when they hear I'm really to go to Washington? I'm so excited I don't know what to do." Mrs. Hollister said no more, and entered pleasantly into the merry talk at the table, telling Shirley what she must be sure to see at the nation's capital. But the next morning, just as Shirley was about to leave for the station, escorted by all the children, Mrs. Hollister came with a package of addressed postal cards, which she had made George get for her the night before, and put them in Shirley's bag. " Just drop us a line as you go along, dear," she said. " I'll feel happier about it to be hearing from you. Mail one whenever you have the chance." Shirley laughed as she looked at the fat package. " All those, mother dear? You must expect I am going to stay a month. You know I won't have much time for writing, and I fully expect to be back to night or to morrow at the latest." " Well, that's all right," said her mother. " You can use them another time then, but you can just put a line on one whenever it is convenient. I shall enjoy getting them even after you get back. You know this is your first journey out into the world alone." Shirley stooped to kiss the little mother. " All right, dear. I'll write you a serial story, each one continued in our next. Good by. Don't take too long a walk to day. I want you rested to hear all I'll have to tell you when I get back to night." Shirley wrote the first postal card as soon as she was settled in the train, describing the other occupants of the car and making a vivid picture of the landscape that was slipping by her windows. She wrote the second in the Baltimore station after she had met Mr. Barnard while he went to get seats in the parlor car, and she mailed them both at Baltimore. The third was written as they neared Washington, with the dim vision of the great monument dawning on her wondering sight in the distance. Her last sentence gave her first impression of the nation's capital. They had eaten lunch in the dining car, a wonderful experience to the girl, and she promised herself another postal devoted to that. But there was no time to write more after they reached Washington. She was put into a taxi and whirled away to an office where her work began. She caught glimpses of great buildings on the way, and gazed with awe at the dome of the Capitol building. Mr. Barnard was kind and pointed out this and that, but it was plain his mind was on the coming interview. When Shirley sat at last in a quiet corner of a big, dark office, her pen poised, her note book ready for work, and looked at the serious faces of the men in the room, she felt as if she had been rushed through a treasure vault of glorious jewels and thrust into the darkness of a tomb. But presently the talk about her interested her. Things were being said about the vital interests of the country, scraps of sentences that reminded her of the trend of talk in the daily papers and the headings of front columns. She looked about her with interest and noted the familiarity with which these men quoted the words of those high up in authority in the government. With awe she began her work, taking down whatever Mr. Barnard dictated, her fingers flying over the tiny pages of the notebook in small, neat characters, keeping pace with the voices going on about her. The detail work she was setting down was not of especial interest to her, save that it was concerned with government work, for its phraseology was familiar and a part of her daily routine office work at home; but she set every sense on the alert to get the tiniest detail and not to make the smallest mistake, understanding from the voices of the men about her that it was of vital interest to the country that this order should be filled quickly and accurately. As she capped her fountain pen and slipped the rubber band on her notebook when it was over, she heard one of the men just behind her say in a low tone to Mr. Barnard: "You're sure of your secretary, of course. I just want to give you the tip that this thing is being very closely watched. We have reason to believe there's some spying planned. Keep your notes carefully, and don't let too many in on this. We know pretty well what's going on, but it's not desirable just now to make any arrests until we can watch a little longer and round up the whole party. So keep your eyes peeled and don't talk." " Oh, certainly, I quite understand," said Mr. Barnard, " and I have a most discreet secretary," and he glanced with a significant smile toward Shirley as she rose. " Of course," said the other. " She looks it," and he bowed deferentially to Shirley as she passed. She did not think of it at the time, but afterwards she recalled how in acknowledging his courtesy she had stepped back a little and almost stumbled over a page, a boy about George's age, who had been standing withdrawn into the shadow of the deep window. She remembered he had a keen, intelligent look, and had apologized and vanished immediately. A moment later it seemed to be the same boy in blue clothes and gilt buttons who held the outer door open for them to pass out. Or was this a taller one? She glanced again at his side face with a lingering thought of George as she paused to fasten her glove and slip her notebook into her hand bag. " I think I will put you into the taxi and let you go right back to the station while I attend to another errand over at the War Department. It won't take me long. We can easily catch that 4 o'clock train back. I suppose you are anxious to get back to night." " Oh, yes," said Shirley earnestly. " I must if possible. Mother isn't well, and she worries so easily." " Well, I don't know why we can't. Then perhaps you can come up to town to morrow and type those notes for us. By the way, I guess it would be better for me to take them and lock them in the safe to night. No, don't stop to get them out now," as Shirley began to unfasten her bag and get the notebook out. " We haven't much time if we want to catch that train. Just look after them carefully, and I'll get them when we're on the train." He helped her into the taxi, gave the order, " To the station," and touching his hat went rapidly over to the War Department Building. No one saw a boy with a blue cap and brass buttons steal forth on a bicycle from the court just below the office, and circling about the asphalt uncertainly for a moment, shoot off across the park. Shirley sat up very straight and kept her eyes about her. She was glad they were taking another way to the station so that she might see more. When she got there she would write another postal, and perhaps it would go on the same train with her. It was all too short, that ride up Pennsylvania Avenue and around by the Capitol. Shirley gathered up her bag and prepared to get out reluctantly. She wished she might have just one more hour to go about, but of course that would be impossible if she wished to reach home to night. But before the driver of the car could get down and open the door for her to get out, a boy with a bicycle slid up to the curb, and touching his gilt button cap respectfully said: "Excuse me, Miss, but Mr. Barnard sent me after you. He says there's been some mistake, and you'll have to come back and get it corrected." " Oh !" said Shirley, too surprised to think for a minute. " Oh ! Then please hurry, for Mr. Barnard wants to get back in time to get that 4 o'clock train." The driver frowned, but the boy stepped up and handed him something, saying: "That's all right, Joe. He sent you this." The driver's face cleared and he started his machine again. The boy vanished into the throng. It was another of Shirley's after memories that she had caught a glimpse of a scrap of paper along with the money the boy had handed the driver, and that he had stuffed it in his pocket after looking intently at it; but at the time she thought nothing of it. She was only glad that they were skimming along rapidly. CHAPTER XXII of the Enchanted Barn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Gail Mattern. The Enchanted Barn by Grace Livingston Hill. Chapter XXII Shirley's sense of direction had always been keen. Even as a child she could tell her way home when others were lost. It was some minutes, however, before she suddenly became aware that the car was being driven in an entirely different direction from the place she had just left Mr. Barnard. For a moment she looked around puzzled, thinking the man was merely taking another way around; but a glance back where the white dome of the Capitol loomed palace like above the city made her sure that something was wrong. She looked at the buildings they were passing, at the names of the streets. F Street! They had not been on that before. These stores and tall buildings were all new to her eyes. Down there at the end of the vista was a great building all columns. Was that the Treasury, and were they merely seeing it from another angle? It was all very confusing, but the time was short. Why had the man not taken the shorter way? She looked at her small wrist watch anxiously and watched eagerly for the end of the street. But before the great building was reached the car suddenly curved around a corner to the right one block, a turn to the left, another turn, a confusion of new names and streets: New York Avenue, Connecticut Avenue, Thomas Circle. The names spun by so fast she could read but few of them, and those she saw she wanted to remember that she might weave them into her next postal. She opened her bag, fumbled for her little silver pencil in the pocket of her coat, and scribbled down the names she could read as she passed, on the back of the bundle of postal cards, and without looking at her writing. She did not wish to miss a single sight. Here were rows of homes, pleasant and palatial, some of them even cozy. The broad avenues were enchanting, the park spaces the lavish scattering of noble statues. But the time was hastening by, and they were going farther and farther from the station and from the direction of the offices where she had been. She twisted her neck once more, and the Capitol dome loomed soft and blended in the distance. A thought of alarm leaped into her mind. She leaned forward and spoke to the driver. " You understood, didn't you, that I am to return to the office where you took me with the gentleman?" The man nodded. " All right, lady. Yes, lady." And the car rushed on, leaping out upon the beautiful way and disclosing new beauties ahead. For a few minutes more Shirley was distracted from her anxiety in wondering whether the great buildings on her right belonged to any of the embassies or not. And then, as the car swerved and plunged into another street and darted into a less thickly populated district, with trees and vacant lots, almost like the country, alarm arose once more, and she looked wildly back and tried to see the signs, but they were going faster still now upon a wide empty road, past stretches of park, with winding drives and charming views, and a great stone bridge to the right, arching over a deep ravine below, a railroad crossing it. There were deer parks fenced with high wire and filled with pretty creatures. Everything went by so fast that Shirley hardly realized that something really must be wrong before she seemed to be in the midst of a strange world aloof. " I am sure you have made a mistake !" The girl's clear voice cut through the driving wind as they rushed along. " I must go back right away to that office from which you brought me. I must go at once, or I shall be too late for my train. The gentleman will be very angry." She spoke in the tone that always brought instant obedience from the employees around the office building at home. But the driver was stolid. He scarcely stirred in his seat to turn toward her. His thick voice was brought back to her on the breeze. " No, lady. It's all right, lady. I had my orders, lady. You needn't to worry. I get you there plenty time." A wild fear seized Shirley, and her heart lifted itself, as was its habit, to God. " Oh, my Father, take care of me, help me, show me what to do !" she cried. Thoughts rushed through her brain as fast as the car rushed over the ground. What was she up against? Was this man crazy or bad? Was he perhaps trying to kidnap her? What for? She shuddered to look the thought in the face. Or was it the notes? She remembered the men in the office and what they had said about keeping still and spying enemies. But perhaps she was mistaken. Maybe this man was only stupid, and it would all come out right in a few minutes. But no, she must not wait for anything like that. She must take no chance. The notes were in her keeping. She must put them where they would be safe. No telling how soon she would be overpowered and searched if that was what they were after. She must hide them, and she must think of some way to send word to Mr. Barnard before it was too late. No telling what moment they would turn from the main road, and she be hidden far from human habitation. She must work fast. What could she do? Scream to the next passer-by? No, for the car was going too fast for that to do any good, and the houses up this way seemed all to be isolated, and few people about. There were houses on ahead beyond the park. She must have something ready to throw out when they came to them. "Oh, God, help me think what to do!" she prayed again, and then, looking down at her bag, she saw the postal cards. Just the thing. Quickly she scribbled, still holding her hand within the bag so that her movements were not noticeable: "Help! Quick! Being carried off. Auto. Connecticut Ave. Park. Deer. Stone Bridge. Phone Mr. Clegg. Don't tell mother. Shirley." She turned the card over, drew a line through her mother's name, and wrote Carol's in its place. Stealthily she slipped the card up her sleeve, dropped her hand carelessly over the side of the car for a moment, let the card flutter from her fingers, and wrote another. She had written 3 cards and dropped them in front of houses before it suddenly occurred to her that even if these cards should be picked up and mailed it would be some time before they reached their destination, and far too late for help to reach her in time. Her heart suddenly went down in a swooning sickness, and her breath almost went from her. Her head was reeling, and all the time she was trying to tell herself that she was exaggerating this thing, that probably the man would slow up, or something, and would all be explained. Yes, he was slowing up, but for what? It was in another lonely spot, and out from the bushes there appeared, as if by magic, another man, a queer looking man with a heavy mustache that looked as if it didn't belong to him. He stood alertly waiting for the car, and sprang into the front seat without waiting for it to stop, or even glancing back at her, and the car shot forward again with great leaps. Shirley dropped out the 2 cards together that she had just written, and leaned forward, touching the newcomer on the arm. "Won't you please make this driver understand that he is taking me to the wrong place?" she said with a pleasant smile. "I must get back to an office 2 or 3 blocks away from the Treasury Building somewhere. I must turn back at once, or I shall miss my appointment and be late for my train. It is quite important. Tell him, please. I will pay him well if he will get me back at once." The stranger turned with an oily smile. "That's all right, miss. He isn't making any mistake. We're taking you right to Secretary Baker's country home. He sent for your man, Mr. What's his name? I forget. Barnard? Oh, yes. He sent for Mr. Barnard to come out there. Sent his private car down for him. And Mr. Barnard, he left orders we should go after you and bring you along. It's something they want to change in those notes you was taking. There was a mistake, and the secretary he wanted to look after the matter himself." Shirley sat back with a sudden feeling of weakness and a fear she might faint, although she had never done such a thing in her life. She was not deceived for an instant now, although she saw at once that she must not let the man know it. The idea that Secretary Baker would pause in the midst of his multiplicity of duties to look into the details of a small article of manufacture was ridiculous. It was equally impossible that Mr. Barnard would have sent strangers after her and let her be carried off in this queer way. He had been most particular that she should be looked after carefully. She was horribly to blame that she had allowed herself to be carried back at all until Mr. Barnard himself appeared, and yet was she? That surely had been the page from the office who came with the message. Well, never mind. She was in for it now, and she must do her best while there was any chance to do anything. She must drop all those postals somehow, and she must hide those notes somewhere, and perhaps write some others, fake ones. What should she do first? "Father, help me, show me. Oh, don't let me lose the notes. Please take care of me." Again and again her heart prayed as her hand worked stealthily in her bag, while she tried to put a pleasant smile upon her face and pretend she was still deceived, leaning forward and speaking to the strange man once more. "Is Secretary Baker's home much farther from here?" she asked, feeling her lips draw stiffly in the frozen smile she forced. " Will it take long? " "'Bout 10 minutes," the man answered graciously with a peculiar look toward the driver. " Nice view around here," he added affably with a leering look of admiration toward her. Shirley's heart stood still with new fear, but she managed to make her white lips smile again and murmur, " Charming." Then she leaned back again and fussed around in her bag, ostentatiously bringing out a clean handkerchief, though she really had been detaching the pages which contained the notes from her loose leaf note book. There were not many of them, for she always wrote closely in small characters. But where should she hide them? Pull the lining away from the edge of her bag and slip them inside? No, for the bag would be the first place they would likely search, and she could not poke the lining back so smoothly that it would not show. If she should try to drop the tiny pages down her neck inside her blouse, the men would very likely see her. Dared she try to slip the leaves down under the linen robe that lay over her lap and put them inside her shoe? She was wearing plain little black pumps, and the pages would easily go in the soles, 3 or 4 in each. Once in, they would be well hidden, and they would not rattle and give notice of their presence. But, oh, what a terrible risk if anything should happen to knock off her shoe, or if they should try to search her. Still, she must take some risk, and this was the safest risk at hand. She must try it and then write out some fake notes, giving false numbers and sizes and other phraseology. Or stay, wasn't there already something written in that book that would answer? Some specifications she had written down for the Tillman Brooks Company? Yes, she was sure. It wasn't at all for the same articles, nor the same measurements, but only an expert would know that. She leaned down quite naturally to pick up her handkerchief, and deftly managed to get 5 small leaves slipped into her right shoe. It occurred to her that she must keep her keepers deceived, so she asked once more in a gracious tone: "Would it trouble you any to mail a card for me as soon as possible after we arrive? I am afraid my mother will be worried about my delay, and she isn't well. I suppose they have a post office out this way." " Sure, Miss," said the man again with another leering smile that made her resolve to have no further conversation than was absolutely necessary. She took out her fountain pen and hurriedly wrote: "Detained longer than I expected. May not get back to night. S. H." and handed the card to the man. He took it and turned it over, all too evidently reading it, and put it in his pocket. Shirley felt that she had made an impression of innocence by the move, which so far was good. She put away her fountain pen deliberately, and managed in doing so to manipulate the rest of the leaves of notes into her left shoe. Somehow that gave her a little confidence, and she sat back and began to wonder if there was anything more she could do. Those dropped postals were worse than useless, of course. Why had she not written an appeal to whoever picked them up? Suiting the action to the thought, she wrote another postal card. Her stock was getting low. There were but 2 more left. For Christ's sake, send the police to help me. I am being carried off by 2 strange men. Shirley Hollister. She marked out the address on the other side and wrote, "To whoever picks this up." She fluttered it to the breeze cautiously, but her heart sank as she realized how little likelihood there was of its being picked up for days perhaps, for who would stop in a car to notice a bit of paper on the road? And there seemed to be but few pedestrians. If she only had something larger, more attractive! She glanced at her belongings, and suddenly remembered the book she had brought with her to read, one of the new novels from the cottage, a goodly sized volume in a bright red cover. The very thing! With a cautious glance at her keepers, she took up the book as if to read, and opening it at the fly leaf began to write surreptitiously much the same message that had been on her last postal, signing her name and home address, and giving her employer's address. Her heart was beating wildly when she had finished. She was trying to think just how she should use this last bit of ammunition to the best advantage. Should she just drop it on the road quietly? If only there was some way to fasten the pages open so her message would be read. Her handkerchief, of course. She folded it cornerwise and slipped it in across the pages so that the book would fall open at the fly leaf, knotting the ends on the back of the cover. Every moment had to be cautious, and she must remember to keep her attitude of reading with the printed pages covering the handkerchief. It seemed hours that it took her, her fingers trembled so. If it had not been for the rushing noise of wind and car she would not have dared so much undiscovered. But apparently her captors were satisfied that she still believed their story about going to Secretary Baker's country house, for they seemed mainly occupied in watching to see if they were pursued, casting anxious glances back now and then, but scarcely noticing her at all. Shirley had noticed 2 or 3 times when a car had passed them that the men both leaned down to do something at their feet to the machinery of the car. Were they afraid of being recognized? Would this perhaps give her a chance to fling her book out where it would be seen by people in an oncoming car? Oh, if she but had the strength and skill to fling it into a car! But of course that was impossible without attracting the attention of the 2 men. Nevertheless, she must try what she could do. She lifted her eyes to the road ahead, and lo! a big car was bearing down upon them. She had almost despaired of meeting any more, for the road was growing more and more lonely, and they must have come many miles. As soon as the 2 men in the front of her sighted the car, they seemed to settle in their seats and draw their hats down a little farther over their eyes. The same trouble seemed to develop with the machinery at their feet that Shirley had noticed before, and they bobbed and ducked and seemed to be wholly engrossed with their own affairs. Shirley's heart was beating so fast that it seemed as though it would suffocate her, and her hand seemed powerless as it lay innocently holding the closed book with the knotted handkerchief turned down out of sight. But she was girding herself, nerving herself for one great last effort, and praying to be guided. The big car came on swiftly and was about to pass when Shirley half rose and hurled her book straight at it, and then sank back in her seat with a fearful terror upon her, closing her eyes for one brief second, not daring to watch the results of her act, if there were to be any results. The men in the front seat suddenly straightened up and looked around. " What's the matter? " growled the man who had got in last, in quite a different tone from any he had used before. " What are you trying to put over on us? " Shirley gasped and caught at her self-control. " I've dropped my book," she stammered out wildly. " Could you stop long enough to pick it up? It was borrowed," she ended sweetly as if by inspiration, and wondering at the steadiness of her tone when blood was pounding so in her throat and ears and everything was black before her. Perhaps, oh, perhaps they would stop and she could cry out to the people for help. The man rose up in his seat and looked back. Shirley cast one frightened glance back, too, and saw in that brief second that the other car had stopped and someone was standing up and looking back. " Hell, no !" said her captor briefly, ducking down in the seat. " Let her out !" he howled to the driver, and the car broke into a galloping streak, the wheels hardly seeming to touch the ground, the tonneau bounding and swaying this way and that. Shirley had all she could do to keep in her seat. At one moment she thought how easy it would be to spring from the car and lie still in a little heap at the roadside. But there were the notes. She must not abandon her trust, even for so fearful an escape from her captors. Suddenly, without warning, they turned a sharp curve and struck into a rough, almost unbroken road into the woods, and the thick growth seemed to close in behind them and shut them out from the world. Shirley shut her eyes and prayed. CHAPTER XXIII of the Enchanted Barn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Gail Mattern. The Enchanted Barn by Grace Livingston Hill. Chapter 23 The next trolley that passed the old barn after the Hollisters had left brought a maidservant and a manservant from the Graham place. The other old servant met them, and together the three went to work. They had brought with them a lot of large dust covers and floor spreads, such as are used by housemaids in cleaning a room, and with these they now proceeded to cover all the large pieces of furniture in the place. In a very short space of time the rugs and bits of carpet were carefully rolled up, the furniture piled in small compass in the middle of the rooms, and everything enveloped in thick coverings. The curtains, bric-a-brac, and even the dishes were put away carefully, and the whole big, inviting home was suddenly denuded. The clothes from the calico curtain clothes presses were folded and laid in drawers, and everything made perfectly safe for a lot of workmen to come into the house. Even the hayloft bedrooms shared in this process. Only a cot was left for the old servant and a few necessary things for him to use, and most of these he transported to the basement, out of the way. When the work was done the man and maid took the trolley back home again, and the other old manservant arranged to make his Sabbath as pleasant as possible in the company of his brother from the nearby farm. Monday morning, promptly at 8 o'clock, the trolley landed a bevy of workmen, carpenters, plasterers, plumbers, and furnace men, with a foreman who set them all at work as if it were a puzzle he had studied out and memorized the solution. In a short time the quiet spot was full of sound, the symphony of industry, the rhythm of toil. Some men were working away with the furnace that had been stored in the cellar. Others were measuring, fitting, cutting holes for lead pipes. Still others were sawing away at the roof, making great gashes in its mossy extent, and two men were busy taking down the old barn door. Out in front more men were building a vat for mortar and opening bags of lime and sand that began to arrive. Three men with curious aprons made of ticking, filled with thin wire nails, were frantically putting lathes on the uprights that the carpenters had already set up, and stabbing them with nails from a seemingly inexhaustible supply in their mouths. It was as if they had all engaged to build the Tower of Babel in a day, and meant to win a prize at it. Such sounds! Such shoutings, such bangings, thumpings, and harsh, raucous noises! The bird in the tall tree looked and shivered, thankful that her brood were well away on their wings before all this cataclysm came to pass. Presently arrived a load of sashes, doors, and wooden frames, and another load of lumber. Things can be done in a hurry if you have money and influence and the will to insist upon what you want. Before night there was a good start made toward big changes in the old barn. Plumbers and gas fitters and men who were putting in the hot water heat chased one another around the place, each man seeking to get his pipes in place before the lathers got to that spot, and the contractor was everywhere, proving his right to be selected for this rush job. As soon as the lathers had finished with a room, the plasterers took possession, and the old door was rapidly being replaced with a great glazed door set in a frame of more sashes, so that the old darkness was gone entirely. In the roof, big dormer windows were taking the place of the two or three little eyebrow affairs that had given air to the hay heretofore, and the loft was fast becoming pleasanter than the floor below. Outside laborers were busy building up a terrace, where a wide cement floor piazza with stone foundations and low stone walls was to run across the entire front. Another chimney was rising from the region of the kitchen. A white enamel sink with a wide drain shelf attached appeared next, with signs of a butler's pantry between kitchen and dining room. A delightful set of china closet doors with little diamond panes that matched the windows was put in one corner of the dining room, and some bookcases with sliding doors began to develop along the walls of the living room. Down in the basement a man was fitting stationary tubs for a laundry, and on both the first floor and the second bathrooms were being made. If the place hadn't been so big, the workmen would have got in one another's way. Closets big and little were being put in, and parts of a handsome staircase were lying about, until you wouldn't know the place at all. Every evening the old servant and the neighbor next door, who used to rent the old barn before he built his own new one, came together to look over what had been accomplished during the day, and to discourse upon this changing world and the wonders of it. The farmer, in fact, learned a great deal about modern improvements, and at once set about bringing some of them to bear upon his own modest farmhouse. He had money in the bank, and why shouldn't he have things convenient for Sally? When Sidney Graham reached the city on Monday morning he scarcely took time to read his mail in the office and give the necessary attention to the day's work before he was up and off again, flying along the Glenside Road as fast as his car would carry him. His mind certainly was not on business that morning. He was as eager as a child to see how work at the old barn was progressing, and the workmen stood small chance of lying down on their job that week, for he meant to make every minute count, no matter how much it cost. He spent a large part of Monday hovering about the old barn, gloating over each new sign of progress, using his imagination on more things than the barn. But when Tuesday arrived, an accumulation of work at the office in connection with a large order that had just come in kept him close to his desk. He had hoped to get away in time to reach Glenside before the workmen left in the afternoon, but 4 o'clock arrived with still a great pile of letters for him to sign before his work would be done for the day. He had just signed his name for the 49th time and laid his pen down with an impatient sigh of relief when the telephone on his desk rang. He hesitated. Should he answer it and be hindered again, or call his secretary and let her attend to it while he slipped away to his well-earned respite? A second insistent ring, however, brought him back to duty, and he reached out and took up the receiver. "Is this Mr. Sidney Graham? Long distance is calling." The young man frowned impatiently, and wished he had sent for his secretary. It was probably another tiresome confab on that Chicago matter, and it really wasn't worth the trouble anyway. Then a small, scared voice at the other end of the wire spoke. "Is that you, Mr. Graham? Well, this is Carol. Say, Mr. Graham, I'm afraid something awful has happened to Shirley. I don't know what to do, and I thought I'd better ask you." Her voice broke off in a gasp like a sob. A cold chill struck at the young man's heart, and a vision of Shirley battling with the ocean waves was instantly conjured up. "Shirley? Where is she? Tell me quick!" he managed to say, though the words seemed to stick in his throat. "She's down at Washington," answered Carol. "Mr. Barnard phoned her last night. There was something special nobody else could take notes about, because it was for a government contract and has to be secret. Mr. Barnard asked her to please go, and she went this morning. Mother didn't like her to go, but she addressed a lot of postal cards for her to write back, and one came postmarked Baltimore in this afternoon's mail, saying she was having a nice time. But just now a call came for mother to go to the telephone. She was asleep, and George was crabbing, so I had to come. It was a strange man in Washington. He said he had just found 3 postal cards on the road addressed to mother that all said, 'Help, quick. 2 men were carrying off Shirley and please to phone to the police.' He took the postals to the police station, but he thought he ought to phone us. And, oh, Mr. Graham, what shall I do? I can't tell mother. It will kill her. And how can we help Shirley?" "Don't tell mother," said Graham quickly, trying to speak calmly out of his horror. "Be a brave girl, Carol. A great deal depends on you just now. Have you phoned Mr. Barnard? Oh, you say he's in Washington? He was to meet your sister in Baltimore? He did meet her, you say? The postal card said she had met him? Well, the next thing is to phone Mr. Clegg and find out if he knows anything. I'll do that at once, and unless he has heard that she is all right, I will start for Washington on the next train. Suppose you stay right where you are till 5:30. I may want to call you up again and need you in a hurry. Then you go back to the cottage as fast as you can and talk cheerfully. Say you went to take a walk. Isn't Elizabeth with you? Well, tell her to help keep your mother from suspecting anything. Above all things, don't cry. It won't do any good, and it may do lots of harm. Get George off by himself, and tell him everything, and tell him I said he was to make some excuse to go downtown after supper and stay at the telephone office till 10 o'clock. I may want to call him up from Washington. Now be a brave little girl. I suspect your sister Shirley would tell you to pray. Good-bye." "I will," gasped Carol. "Good-bye." Graham pressed his foot on the bell under his desk, and reached out to slam his desk drawer shut and put away his papers. His secretary appeared at the door. "Get me Barnard and Clegg on the phone. Ask for Mr. Barnard, or if he isn't in, Mr. Clegg. Then go out to the other phone and call up the station. Find out what's the next express to Washington. Tell Bromwell to be ready to drive me to the station and bring my car back to the garage." He was working rapidly as he talked, putting papers in the safe, jotting down a few notes for the next day's work, trying to think of everything at once. The secretary handed him the phone, quietly saying, "Mr. Clegg on the phone," and went out of the room. Excited conference with Mr. Clegg brought out the fact that he was but just in receipt of a telegram from police headquarters in Washington, saying that a book with Barnard and Clegg's address and an appeal from a young woman named Shirley Hollister, who was apparently being kidnapped by 2 strange men in an auto, had been flung into a passing car and brought to them. They had sent forces in search of the girl at once, and would do all in their power to find her. Meantime, they would like any information that would be helpful in the search. Mr. Clegg was much excited. He appeared to have lost his head. He seemed glad to have another cooler mind at work on the case. He sputtered a good deal about the importance of the case and the necessity for secrecy. He said he hoped it wouldn't get into the papers, and that it would be Barnard and Clegg's undoing if it did. He seemed more concerned about that and the notes that Shirley probably had than about the girl's situation. When Graham brought him up rather sharply, he admitted that there had been a message from Barnard that he would be detained overnight probably, but he had attached no significance to that. He knew Barnard's usual hotel address in Washington, but hadn't thought to phone him about the telegram from police headquarters. Graham hung up at last in a panic of fury and dismay, ringing violently for his secretary again. "The next train leaves at 5 o'clock," she said capably as she entered. "Bromwell has gone after the car. I told him to buy you a mileage book and save your time at this end. You have 40 minutes, and he will be back in plenty of time." "Good," said Graham. "Now call up long distance and get me police headquarters in Washington. No, use the phone in father's office, please. I'll have to use this while you're getting them." As soon as she had left the room he called up the shore again, and was fortunate in getting Carol almost immediately, the poor child being close at hand, all in a tremble, with Elizabeth, in no less a state of nervousness, brave and white, waiting for orders. "Can you give me an exact description of your sister's dress, and everything that she had with her when she started this morning?" asked Graham, prepared with pen and paper to write it down. Carol summoned her wits and described Shirley's simple outfit exactly, even down to the little black pumps on her feet, and went mentally through the small hand bag she had carried. "Oh, yes," she added, "and she had a book to read, one she found here in the cottage. It had a red cover and was called 'From the Car Behind.'" Graham wrote them all down carefully, asked a few more details of Shirley's plans, and bade Carol again to be brave and go home with a message to George to be at the phone from 8:30 till 10. He was all ready to go to his train when the Washington call came in, and as he hurried to his father's office to answer it he found his heart crying out to an unseen power to help in this trying hour and protect the sweet girl in awful peril. "Oh, God, I love her!" he found his heart saying over and over again, as if it had started out to be an individual by itself, without his will or volition. There was no comfort from Washington Police Headquarters. Nothing more had been discovered save another crumpled postal lying along the roadside. They received with alacrity, however, Mr. Barnard's Washington hotel address and the description of the young woman and her belongings. When Graham had finished the hasty conversation he had to fly to make his train, and when at last he lay back in his seat in the parlor car and let the waves of his anxiety and trouble roll over him, he was almost overwhelmed. He had led a comparatively tranquil life for a young man who had never tried to steer clear of trouble, and this was the first great calamity that had ever come his way. Calamity? No, he would not own yet that it was a calamity. He was hurrying to her. He would find her. He would not allow himself to think that anything had befallen her. But wherever she was, if she was still alive, no matter how great her peril, he was sure she was praying now, and he would pray too. Yes, pray as she had taught him. Oh, God, if he only knew how to pray better! What was it she had said so often? "Whatsoever ye ask in my name?" Yes, that was it. "I will do it." What was that talismanic name? Ah, Christ! Oh, God, in the name of Christ! But when he came to the thought of her, she was too exquisite and dear to be put into words, so his petition went up in spirit form, unframed by words to weight it down, wafted up by the pain of a soul in torture. At Baltimore it occurred to Graham to send a telegram to Barnard to meet him at the train, and when he got out at Union Station the first person he saw was Barnard, white and haggard, looking for him through the bars of the train gate. He grasped the young man's hand as if it were a last straw for a drowning man to cling to, and demanded in a shaking voice to know if he had heard anything from Miss Hollister. One of the first questions that Graham asked was whether Barnard had been back to the office where Miss Hollister had taken the dictation to report her disappearance. "Well, no, I hadn't thought of that," said Barnard blankly. "What would they know about it? The fact is, I was rather anxious to keep the facts from getting to them. You see, they warned me that there were parties anxious to get hold of those specifications. It's government work, you know." "They should know at once," said Graham sternly. "They may have inside information which would give us a clue to follow. The Secret Service men are on to a lot of things that we common mortals don't suspect." Mr. Barnard looked mortified and convinced. "Well, what have you done so far? We would better understand each other thoroughly so as to save time and not go over old ground. You have been in communication with police headquarters, of course," said Graham. "Why, no," said the older man apologetically. "You see, I got here just in time for the train,
and failing to find the young lady in the station where we had agreed to meet, I took it for granted that she had used the extra time in driving about to see a few sights in the city as I suggested, and had somehow failed to get back in time. I couldn't understand it, because she had been quite anxious to get home to night. I could have caught the train myself, but didn't exactly like to leave her alone in a strange city, though of course it's perfectly safe for a steady girl like that. Afterward it occurred to me that she might have gotten on the train, and perhaps I should have done so too. But there was really very little time to decide, for the train pulled out 2 minutes after I reached the station. I waited about here for a time, and then went over to the Continental where my sister is stopping, thinking I would ask her to stay in the station and watch for the young lady, and I would go home. But I found my sister had run down to the shore for a few days, so I had something to eat, and while I was in the dining room your telegram came. I was hoping somehow you had seen Miss Hollister, or had word from her, and it was all right." One could see the poor man had no conception of what was due to a lady in his care, and Graham looked at him for a moment with rage, wishing he could take him by the throat and shake some sense into him. "Then you don't know that she's been kidnapped and the police are out on track for her," said Graham dryly. "No, you don't say!" exclaimed Barnard, turning white and showing he had some real feeling after all. "Kidnapped? Why, how could she? And she's got those notes. Why, Graham, you're fooling. Why, how came you to know?" Graham told him tersely as he walked the man over to the telephone booths, and finished with: "Now, you go in that booth and phone your government man, and I'll call up police headquarters and see what's doing. We've got to work fast, for there's no telling what may have happened in the last 3 hours. It's up to us to find that girl before anything worse happens to her." White and trembling, Barnard tottered into the booth. When he came out again the sleuth hounds of the Secret Service were on the trail of Shirley Hollister's captors. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of The Enchanted Barn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Gail Mattern. The Enchanted Barn by Grace Livingston Hill. Chapter 24. The car that was bearing Shirley Hollister through the lonely wooded road at a breathless speed suddenly came to a halt in the rear of an old house whose front faced on another road equally lonely. During the brief time that they had been in the woods the sky seemed to have perceptibly darkened with the coming evening. Shirley looked about her with increased fright. It was almost night, and here was her prison, far from town or human dwelling place. Even the road was at some distance in front of the house, and there were more woods on either side. "This here is Secretary Baker's summer home," announced the man who had done the talking, as he climbed out of the car and opened the door for her. "You can just step in the back door and go through to the parlor. The help's all out this afternoon. The Secretary'll be down presently. He always takes a nap afternoons about this time. I'll tell him you've come." There seemed nothing to do but obey, and Shirley chose to let the farce continue. Surely the man must know she was not a fool, but it was better than open hostility. There was nothing to be gained by informing him that she knew how he was guying her. "Oh, Jesus Christ, I trust myself to you," she breathed in her heart as she stepped across the leaf-strewn grass and looked about her, wondering whether she should ever walk the earth again after she had stepped into the dim, tree-shrouded house. But why go in? "I think I will remain out here," she said calmly, albeit her heart was pounding away like a trip hammer. "Please tell Mr. Baker to come to me here. It is much pleasanter than in the house a day like this." "Ah, no, you won't neither. The Secretary don't receive in the open air, even in summer," drawled the man, and she noticed that he and the driver straightened up and stepped closer to her, one on either side. She gave one wild glance toward the open space. There was simply no chance at all to run away, even if she succeeded in eluding them at the start by a quick, unexpected dash. They were alert, athletic men, and no telling how many more were hidden in the house. "Oh, very well, of course, if it's a matter of etiquette," said Shirley pleasantly, determined to keep up the farce as long as possible. A cold, dark air met the girl as she stepped within the creaking door and looked about her. At her left was an old-fashioned kitchen, dusty and cobwebby. A long, narrow hall led to the front of the house, and her guide pointed her toward a room on the right. There was something hollow and eerie in the sound of their footsteps
on the old oaken floor. The room into which she was ushered was musty and dusty as the rest. The floor was covered with an ancient ingrain carpet. The table was covered with a magenta felt cover, stamped with a vine of black leaves and riddled with moth holes. The walls were hung with old prints and steel engravings, suspended by woolen cords and tassels. The furniture was dilapidated. Everything was covered with dust, but there were finger marks in the dust here and there that showed that the place had been recently visited. Through an open doorway an old square piano was visible in what must be the parlor. The place seemed to Shirley fairly teeming with memories of some family now departed. She leaped to the quick conclusion that the house had been long deserted and had only recently been entered and used as a rendezvous for illegal conferences. It occurred to her that there might be an opportunity for her to hide her precious papers somewhere safely if it came to it that she must be searched. How about that piano? Could she slip some of them between the keys? But it was hardly likely that there would be opportunity for anything like that. She felt strangely calm as she looked about upon her prison. He ain't come yet," remarked her guide as he glanced into the front room. "Well, you can set down. He won't be long now. Joe, you just look about a bit and see if you can find the secretary, and tell him the young lady is here." The man flung himself full length on the carpet covered couch and looked at her with satisfaction. "What train was that you said you must make? I'm afraid now you might be going to be just a trifle late if he doesn't get a hustle on, but you can't hurry a great man like that, you know." "Oh, it's no matter," said Shirley coolly, looking around her with the utmost innocence. "What a quaint old house! Has it been in the family a long time?" The man looked at her amusedly. "You're a cute one," he remarked affably. "I believe you're a pretty good sport. You know perfectly well you're in my power and can't do a turn to help yourself, yet you sail around here as calm as a queen. You're some looker, too. Blamed if I'm not enjoying myself. I wouldn't mind a kiss or two from those pretty lips." But Shirley had melted through the doorway into the other room, and her voice floated back with charming indifference as if she had not heard, though she was ready to scream with loathing and fear of the man. "Why, isn't this a delightful old piano? The keys are actually mother of pearl. Isn't it odd? Would Mr. Baker mind if I played on it?" And before her astonished captor could get himself to the doorway she had sat down on the rickety old haircloth stool and swept the keys lightly. The old chords trembled and shivered as if awaking from a tomb, and uttered forth a quavering, sweet sound like ancient memories. The man was much too astonished to stop her. Amused, too, perhaps, and interested. Her white fingers over the dusty pearls in the growing dusk had a strange charm for the hardened reprobate, like the wonder of a flower dropped into the foulness of a prison. Before he could recover, he was startled again by her voice, soaring out in the empty, echoing house. "Rock of ages, cleft for me, let me hide myself in thee. Let the water and the blood from thy riven side which flowed be of sin the double cure. Save me, Lord, and make me pure." Perhaps those dim, gloomy walls had echoed before to the grand old tune, but never could it have been sung in direr strait, or with more earnest cry from a soul in distress. She had chosen the first words that seemed to fit the chords she had struck, but every syllable was a prayer to God in whom she trusted. It may be the man felt the power of her appeal as he stood rooted in the doorway and listened while she sang through all the verses she could remember. But the last trembling note was broken harshly by Joe's voice at the kitchen door in sharp, rasping orders. "Hist there! Can that noise! Do you want to raise hell here? Wake up Sam! Get on to your job. Hennie's coming." "That's all right, Joe. Dry up. This is good Sunday school dope. This won't rouse no suspicions. Go to the devil and mind your business. I know what I'm about." Shirley was almost ready to cry, but she drew a deep breath and started on another song. "Jesus, lover of my soul, let me to thy bosom fly, while the nearer waters roll, while the tempest still is high. Hide me, O my Saviour, hide, till the storm of life is past." On through the time-worn words she sang, while the sin-hardened man stood silently and listened. His eyes had gradually lost their leer and grown soft and tender, as if some childhood memories of home and mother and a time when he was innocent and good were looking out his eyes, reminding him of what he once intended to be before he ate the apple of wisdom and became as the gods and devils. Shirley gradually became aware that she was holding her strange audience, and a power beyond herself steadied her voice and kept her fingers from trembling on the old pearl keys as she wandered on from song to song, perhaps happening on the very ones, who knows, that this man standing in the dying twilight of the old gloomy house had sung beside his mother's hearth or in church during his childhood. Certain it is that he stood there silent and listened for at least half an hour without an interruption, while the light in the big room grew dimmer and dimmer, and all about the house seemed still as death in the intervals between her voice. She was just beginning, "Abide with me. Fast falls the eventide. The darkness deepens. Lord, with me abide," when the man put his hand in his pocket and brought out a candle. Scratching a match on his trousers, he lit the candle and set it carefully on the piano, where its light fell flickering, wavering over her worn young face; and who shall say that she was not a messenger from another world to this man who had long trodden the downward path? They were interrupted, however, before this song was finished, by a newcomer who entered like a shadow and stood at the end of the piano, looking wonderingly from Shirley to the man when she glanced up. She stopped, startled; for although he wore no brass buttons nor blue clothes, she was quite sure those were the very same gray eyes that had looked at her from the recess of the window in the government office that afternoon; perhaps the same boy who had come after her car and sent her off on this long way into the wilderness. The man Sam straightened up suddenly and looked about him, half ashamed, with an apologetic grin. "Oh, you've come, have you, Hennie? Well, you been a long time about it. But now I guess we'll get to work. Where's Joe? Out in the watch? All right then, miss, if you've no objection, we'll just take a little vacation on the psalm singing and turn our attention to worldly things. I calculate you're sharp enough to know what we brought you out here for. I acknowledge you can sing real well, and you sort of got my goat for a while there with all that morning bench tra-la, for you certainly have got that holy dope down fine. But now the time's come for business, and you needn't to think that because I can enjoy a little sentiment now and then in a leisure moment that you can put anything over on me, for it can't be did. I mean business, and I've got you in my power. We're 10 miles from any settlement, and no neighbors anywheres about. Everybody moved away. So it won't do any good to work any funny business on us. You can't get away. We're all armed, and no one knows where you are. If you behave yourself and do as you're told, there won't be any trouble. We'll just transact our business, and then we'll have a bit of supper and maybe a few more tunes. Got any ragtime in your repertoire? And then sometime after midnight, when the moon's good and dark, we'll get you back to civilization where you won't have no trouble in getting home. But if you act up and get funny, why, you know what to expect. There was a young girl murdered once in this house and buried in the cellar, and ever since folks say it's haunted and they won't come near it. That's the kind of a place we're in. So now, are you ready?" Shirley sat cold and still. It seemed as if her life blood had suddenly congealed in her veins, and for a second she felt as if her senses were going to desert her. Then the echo of her own song, "Hide me, oh my Saviour, hide," seemed to cry out from her soul silently, and she rallied once more and gained her self-control. "Well, miss," went on the man impressively, "I see you're ready for the question. And you've got your nerve with you, too. I'll hand you that. But I warn you, it won't do no good. We brung you out here to get a hold of that notebook you wrote in this morning, and we're going to have it. We know that Mr. Barnard left it in your care. Hennie here heard him say for you to keep it. So it won't be of any use for you to lie about it." "Of course," said Shirley, standing up and reaching over for her handbag, which she had laid on the piano beside her while she played. "I understand perfectly. But I'd like to ask you a question, Mr. " "Smith or Jones, whichever you like to call it. Spit it out." "I suppose you are paid to bring me out here, Mr. Smith, and get my property away from me," she said gravely. "Well, yes. We don't calculate to do it just for sweet charity." "And I am paid to look after my notebook, you see. It's a trust that has been given me. I just have to look after it. It's out of the question for me to desert it." Shirley spoke coolly and held her little bag close in the firm grasp of her two hands. The man stared at her and laughed. The boy Hennie fairly gaped in his astonishment. A girl with all that nerve! "Of course I understand perfectly that you can murder me and bury me down in the cellar beside that other girl that was murdered, and perhaps no one will find it out for a while, and you can go on having a good time on the money you will get for it. But the day will come when you will have to answer for it. You know I didn't come here alone to day." Both men looked startled and glanced uneasily into the shadows, as if there might be someone lurking there. "God came with me, and He knows. He'll make you remember some day." The boy laughed out a nervous ha ha of relief, but the man seemed held, fascinated by her look and words. There was silence for a second, while the girl held off the ruffian in the man by sheer force of her strong personality. Then the boy laughed again, with a sneer in the end of it, and the spell was broken. The leer came into the eyes of the man again. The sneer of the boy had brought him to himself, to the self he had come to be. "Nix on the sob stuff, girlie," he said gruffly. "It won't go down with me. We're here for business, and we've been delayed too long already. Come now, will you hand out that notebook, or will we have to search you?" He took one stride across to where she stood and wrenched the handbag from her grasp before she was aware of his intention. She had not meant to give it up without a struggle, much as she had loathed the thought of one. She must make the matter last as long as possible, if perchance God was sending help to her, and must contest every inch of the way as far as lay in her power. Oh, had any one picked up her cards? Had the book with its message reached any friendly eye? Frail and white and stern, she stood with folded arms while they turned out the contents of the little bag and scattered it over the piano, searching with clumsy fingers among her dainty things. The notebook she had rolled within her handkerchiefs and made it hard to find. She feared lest her ruse would be discovered when they looked it over. The boy was the one who clutched for the little book, recognizing it as the one he had seen in the office that morning. The man hung over his shoulder and peered in the candlelight, watching the boy anxiously. It meant a good deal of money if they put this thing through. "Here it is," said the boy, fluttering through the leaves and carefully scrutinizing the shorthand characters. "Yes, that's the dope." He ran his eye down the pages, caught a word here and there, technicalities of manufacture, the very items, of course, that he wanted, if this had been the specifications for the government order. Shirley remembered with relief that none of the details were identical, however, with the notes she carried in her shoes. The book notes were, in fact, descriptive of an entirely different article from that demanded by the government. The question was, would these people be wise enough to discover that fact before she was out of their power, or not? Furtively she studied the boy. There was something keen and cunning about his youthful face. He was thick set, with blond hair and blue eyes. He might be of German origin, though there was not a sign of accent about his speech. He had the bulldog chin, retreating forehead, and eagle nose of the Kaiser in embryo. Shirley saw all this as she studied him furtively. That he was an expert in shorthand was proved by the ease with which he read some of her obscure sentences, translating rapidly here and there as he examined the book. Was he well enough informed about the government contract to realize that these were not the notes she had taken in the office that morning? And, should he fail to recognize it, was there perhaps someone higher in authority to whom they would be shown before she was released? She shivered, and set her weary toes tight with determination over the little crinkling papers in her shoes. Somehow she would protect those notes from being taken, even if she had to swallow them. There surely would be a way to hide them if the need came. Suddenly the tense strain under which she was holding herself was broken by the man. He looked up with a grin, rubbing his hands with evident self-congratulation and relief. "That's all right, girlie. That's the dope we want. Now we won't trouble you any longer. We'll have supper. Hennie, you go get some of that wood out in the shed, and we'll have a fire on the hearth and make some coffee." But Shirley, standing white and tense in the dim shadow of the room, suddenly felt the place whirling about her and the candle dancing far off. Her knees gave way beneath her, and she dropped back to the piano stool weakly, and covered her face with her hands, pressing hard on her eyeballs, trying to keep her senses and stop this black dizziness that threatened to submerge her consciousness. She must not faint, if this was fainting. She must keep her senses and guard her precious shoes. If one of those should fall off while she was unconscious, all would be undone. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of The Enchanted Barn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Gail Mattern. The Enchanted Barn by Grace Livingston Hill. Chapter 25. The man looked up from the paper he was twisting for a fire and saw Shirley's attitude of despair. "Say, kid," he said with a kind of gruff tenderness, "you don't need to take it that a way. I know it's tough luck to lose out when you been so nervy and all, but you knew we had it over you from the start. You hadn't a show. And say, girlie, I'll tell you what. I'll make Hennie sit down right now and copy 'em off for you, and you can put 'em in your book again when you get back, and nobody be the wiser. We'll just take out the leaves. We got to keep the original, of course, but that won't make any beans for you. It won't take you no time to write 'em over again if he gives you a copy." Somehow it penetrated through Shirley's tired consciousness that the man was trying to be kind to her. He was pitying her and offering her a way out of her supposed dilemma, offering to assist her in some of his own kind of deception. The girl was touched, even through all her other crowding emotions and weariness. She lifted up her head with a faint little smile. " Thank you," she said wearily, " but that wouldn't do me any good." " Why not? " asked the man sharply. " Your boss would never know it got out through you." " But I should know I had failed," she said sadly. " If you had my notes I should know that I had failed in my trust." " It wouldn't be your fault. You couldn't have helped it." " Oh, yes, I could, and I ought. I shouldn't have let the driver turn around. I should have got out of that car and waited at the station, as Mr. Barnard told me to do, till he came. I had been warned, and I ought to have been on my guard, so you see it was my fault." She drooped her head forward and rested her chin dejectedly on the palm of her hand, her elbow on her knee. The man stood looking at her for a second in half indignant astonishment. " By golly !" he said at last. " You certainly are some nut. Well, anyhow, buck up and let's have some tea. Sorry I can't see my way clear to help you out any further, being as we're sort of partners in this job, and you certainly have got some nerve for a girl, but you know how it is. I guess I can't do no more'n I said. I got my honor to think about, too. See? Hennie, get a move on. We ain't waiting all night for eats. Bring in them things from the cupboard and let's get to work." Shirley declined to come to the table when at last the repast was ready. She said she was not hungry. In fact, the smell of the crackers and cheese and pickles and dried beef sickened her. She felt too hysterical to try to eat, and besides she had a lingering feeling that she must keep near that piano. If anything happened she had a vague idea that she might somehow hide the precious notes within the big old instrument. The man frowned when she declined to come to supper, but a moment later stumbled awkwardly across the room with a slopping cup of coffee and set it down beside her. " Buck up, girlie !" he growled. " Drink that and you'll feel better." Shirley thanked him and tried to drink a few mouthfuls. Then the thought occurred to her that it might be drugged, and she swallowed no more. But she tried to look a bit brighter. If she must pass this strange evening in the company of these rough men it would not help matters for her to give way to despair. So, after toying with the teaspoon a moment, she put the cup down and began to play soft airs on the old piano again, while the men ate and took a stealthy taste now and then from a black bottle. She watched them furtively as she played, marveling at their softened expressions, remembering the old line, " Music hath charms to soothe the savage breast," and wondering if perhaps there were not really something in it. If she had not been in such a terrifying situation she would really have enjoyed the character study that this view of those two faces afforded her, as she sat in the shadow playing softly while they ate with the flaring candle between them. " I like music with my meals," suddenly chanted out the boy in an interval. But the man growled in a low tone, " Shut up ! Ain't you got no manners ?" Shirley prolonged that meal as much as music could do it, for she had no relish for a more intimate tete a tete with either of her companions. When she saw them grow restless she began to sing again, light little airs this time with catchy words, or old tender melodies of home and mother and childhood. They were songs she had sung that last night in the dear old barn when Sidney Graham and Elizabeth were with them, and unconsciously her voice took on the wail of her heart for all that dear past so far away from her now. Suddenly, as the last tender note of a song died away, Joe stumbled breathlessly into the room. The boy Hennie slithered out of the room like a serpent at his first word. " Beat it !" he cried in a hoarse whisper. " Get a move on. All hell's out after us. I bet they heard her singing. Take her and beat it. I'll douse the fire and out the candle." He seized a full bucket of water and dashed it over the dying fire. Shirley felt the other man grasp her arm in a fierce grip. Then Joe snuffed out the candle with his broad thumb and finger, and all was pitch dark. She felt herself dragged across the floor, regardless of furniture in the way, stumbling, choking with fear, her one thought that whatever happened she must not let her slippers get knocked off, holding her feet in a tense strain with every muscle extended to keep the shoes fastened on like a vise. She was haunted with a wild thought of how she might have slipped under the piano and eluded her captor if only the light had gone out 1 second sooner before he reached her side. But it was too late to think of that now, and she was being dragged along breathlessly, out the front door perhaps, and down a walk. No, it was amongst trees, for she almost ran into one. The man swore at her, grasped her arm till he hurt her, and she cried out. "You shut up or I'll shoot you!" he said with an oath. He had lost all his suavity, and there was desperation in his voice. He kept turning his head to look back and urging her on. She tripped on a root and stumbled to her knees, bruising them painfully, but her only thought was one of joy that her shoes had not come off. The man swore a fearful oath under his breath, then snatched her up and began to run with her in his arms. It was then she heard Graham's voice calling, "Shirley, where are you? I'm coming." She thought she was swooning or dreaming, and that it was not really he, for how could he possibly be here? But she cried out with a voice as clear as a bell, "I'm here, Sidney! Come quick!" In his efforts to hush her voice the man stumbled and fell with her in his arms. There came other voices and forms through the night. She was gathered up in strong, kind arms and held. The last thought she had before she sank into unconsciousness was that God had not forgotten. He had been remembering all the time and sent his help before it was too late, just as she had known all along he must do, because he had promised to care for his own, and she was one of his little ones. When she came to herself again she was lying in Sidney Graham's arms with her head against his shoulder, feeling, oh, so comfortable and tired. There were 2 automobiles with powerful headlights standing between the trees, and a lot of policemen in the shadowy background. Her captor stood sullen against a tree, with his hands and feet shackled. Joe stood between 2 policemen with a rope bound about his body spirally, and the boy Hennie, also bound, beside his fallen bicycle, turned his ferret eyes from side to side as if he hoped even yet to escape. 2 other men with hawk-like faces that she had not seen before were there also, manacled, and with eyes of smoldering fires. Climbing excitedly out of one of the big cars came Mr. Barnard, his usually immaculate pink face smutty and weary, his sparse white hair rumpled giddily, and a worried pucker on his kind, prim face. " Oh, my dear Miss Hollister, how unfortunate !" he exclaimed. " I do hope you haven't suffered too much inconvenience." Shirley smiled up at him from her shoulder of refuge as from a dream. It was all so amusing and impossible after what she had been through. It couldn't be real. " I assure you I am very much distressed on your account," went on Mr. Barnard politely and hurriedly, " and I hate to mention it at such a time, but could you tell me whether the notes are safe? Did those horrid men get anything away from you?" A sudden flicker of triumph passed over the faces of the fettered man and the boy like a ripple over still water, and died away into unintelligence; but Shirley's voice rippled forth in a glad, clear laugh as she answered joyously: "Yes, Mr. Barnard, they got my notebook, but not the notes. They thought the Tillman Brooks notes were what they were after, but the real notes are in my shoes. Won't you please get them out, for I'm afraid I can't hold them on any longer. My feet ache so." It is a pity that Shirley was not in a position to see the look of astonishment followed by a twinkle of actual appreciation that came over the face of the shackled man beside the tree as he listened. One could almost fancy he was saying to himself: "The nervy little nut! She put one over on me after all." It was also a pity that Shirley could not have got the full view of the altogether precise and conventional Mr. Barnard kneeling before her on the ground, removing carefully with deep embarrassment and concern, first one, then the other of her little black pumps, extracting the precious notes, counting over the pages, and putting them ecstatically into his pocket. No one of that group but Shirley could fully appreciate the ludicrous picture he made. " You are entirely sure that no one but yourself has seen these notes?" he asked anxiously, as if he hardly dared to believe the blessed truth. "Entirely sure, Mr. Barnard," said Shirley happily. "And now, if you wouldn't mind putting on my shoes again, I can relieve Mr. Graham of the necessity of carrying me any further." " Oh, surely, surely !" said Mr. Barnard, quite fussed, and getting down laboriously again, his white forelock all tossed, and his forehead perplexed over the unusual task. How did women get into such a little trinket of a shoe, anyway? "I assure you, Miss Hollister, our firm appreciates what you have done. We shall not forget it. You will see, we shall not forget it," he puffed as he rose with beads of perspiration on his brow. " You have done a great thing for Barnard and Clegg to day." " She's done more than that," said a burly policeman, significantly glancing around the group of sullen prisoners as Graham put her upon her feet beside him. " She's rounded up the whole gang for us, and that's more than anybody else has been able to do yet. She ought to get a medal of some kind for that." Then, with a dare devil lift of his head and a gleam of something like fun in his sullen eyes, the manacled man by the tree spoke out, looking straight at Shirley, real admiration in his voice. " I say, pard, I guess you're the winner. I'll hand you what's coming to you if I do lose. You certainly had your nerve." Shirley looked at him with a kind of compassion in her eyes. " I'm sorry you have to be there," she finished. " You were as fine as you could be to me under the circumstances, I suppose. I thank you for that." The man met her gaze for an instant, a flippant reply upon his lips, but checked it, and dropping his eyes was silent. The whole little company under the trees were hushed into silence before the miracle of a girl's pure spirit leaving its impress on a blackened soul. Then quietly Graham led her away to his car with Barnard and the detectives following. The prisoners were loaded into the other cars and hurried on the way to judgment. CHAPTER XXVI of the Enchanted Barn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Gail Mattern. The Enchanted Barn by Grace Livingston Hill. Chapter 26. The ride back to the city was like a dream to Shirley afterward. To see the staid Mr. Barnard so excited, babbling away about her bravery, and exulting like a child over the recovery of the precious notes, was wonder enough. But to feel the quiet protection and tender interest of Sidney Graham filled her with ecstasy. Of course it was only kindly interest and friendly anxiety, and by to morrow she would have put it into order with all his other kindlinesses; but to night, weary and excited as she was, with the sense of horror over her recent experience still upon her, it was sweet to feel his attention, and to let his voice thrill through her tired heart without stopping to analyze it and be sure she was not too glad over it. What if he would be merely a friend to morrow again? To night he was her rescuer, and she would rest back upon that and be happy. "I feel that I was much to blame for leaving you alone to go to the station with a bait like these notes in your possession," said Mr. Barnard humbly, "though of course I did not dream that there was any such possibility as your being in danger." "It is just as well not to run any risks in these days when the country is so unsettled," said the detective dryly. " Especially where a lady is concerned," remarked Graham significantly. " I suppose I should have taken Miss Hollister with me and left her in the cab while I transacted my business at the War Department," said Barnard with self reproach in his tones. " They would have only done the same thing in front of the War Department," said the detective convincingly. " They had it all planned to get those notes somehow. You only made it a trifle easier for them by letting the lady go alone. If they hadn't succeeded here they would have followed you to your home and got into your office or your safe. They are determined, desperate men. We've been watching them for some time, letting them work till we could find out who was behind them. To night we caught the whole bunch red handed, thanks to the lady's cleverness. But you had better not risk her alone again when there's anything like this on hand. She might not come out so easy next time." Graham muttered a fervent applause in a low tone to this advice, tucking the lap robes closer about the girl. Barnard gave little shudders of apology as he humbly shouldered the blame. " Oh, no, of course not. I certainly am so sorry." But Shirley suddenly roused herself to explain. " Indeed, you mustn't any of you blame Mr. Barnard. He did the perfectly right and natural thing. He always trusts me to look after my notes, even in the most important cases, and I heard the warning as much as he did. It was my business to be on the lookout. I'm old enough and have read enough in the papers about spies and ruffians. I ought to have known there was something wrong when that boy ordered me back and said Mr. Barnard had sent me word. I ought to have known Mr. Barnard would never do that. I did know just as soon as I stopped to think. The trouble was, I was giving half my attention to looking at the strange sights out of the window, and thinking what I would tell the folks at home about Washington, or I would not have got into such a position. I insist that you shall not blame yourself, Mr. Barnard. It is a secretary's business to be on her job, and not be out having a good time when she is on a business trip. I hadn't got beyond the city limits before I knew exactly what I ought to have done. I should have asked that boy more questions, and I should have got right out of that car and told him to tell you I would wait in the station till you came for me. It troubled me from the start that you had sent for me that way. It wasn't like you. Then they turned their questions upon her, and she had to tell the whole story of her capture, Graham and Barnard exclaiming indignantly as she went on, the detective sitting grim and serious, nodding his approval now and then. Graham's attitude toward her grew more tender and protective. Once or twice, as she told of her situation in the old house, or spoke of how the man dragged her along in the dark, he set his teeth and drew his breath hard, saying in an undertone, "The villain!" And there was that in the way that he looked at her that made Shirley hasten through the story because of the wild, joyous clamor of her heart. As soon as the city limits were reached, Graham stopped the car to telephone. It was after 11 o'clock, and there was little chance that George would have stayed at the phone so long, but he would leave a message for the early morning at least. George, however, had stuck to his post. "Sure, I'm here yet. What do you think? Couldn't sleep, could I, with my sister off alone with a fella somewhere being kidnapped? What do you say? Found her? She's all right? Aw, gee, that's good. I told Carol you would. I told her not to worry. What'd you say? Oh, Shirley's going to talk? Oh, hello, Shirley. How's Washington? Some speed, eh? Say, when you coming home? Tomorrow? That's good. No, mother doesn't know a thing. She thinks I went to bed early 'cause I planned to go fishing at sunrise. She went to bed herself early. Say, Mr. Graham's a prince, isn't he? Well, I guess I'll go to bed now. I might make the fishing in the morning yet if I don't sleep too late. I sure am glad you're all right. Well, so long, Shirley." Shirley turned from the phone with tears in her eyes. It wasn't what George said that made her smile tenderly through them, but the gruff tenderness in his boy tones that touched her so. She hadn't realized before what she meant to him. They drove straight to the station, got something to eat, and took the midnight train back to their home city. Graham had protested that Shirley should go to a hotel and get a good rest before attempting the journey, but she laughingly told him she could rest anywhere and would sleep like a top in the train. When Graham found that it was possible to secure berths in the sleeper for them all, and that they would not have to get out until 7 in the morning, he withdrew his protests, and his further activities took the form of supplementing her supper with fruit and bonbons. His lingering hand clasp as he bade her good night told her how glad he was that she was safe, as if his eyes had not told her the same story every time there had been light enough for them to be seen. Locked at last into her safe little stateroom, with a soft bed to lie on and no bothersome notes to be guarded, one would have thought she might have slept, but her brain kept time to the wheels, and her heart with her brain. She was going over and over the scenes of the eventful day and living through each experience again, until she came to the moment when she looked up to find herself in Sidney Graham's arms, with her face against his shoulder. Her face glowed in the dark at the remembrance, and her heart thrilled wildly sweet with the memory of his look and tone, and all his carefulness for her. How wonderful that he should have come so many miles to find her! That he should have been the one to find her first, with all those other men on the hunt. He had forged ahead and picked her up before any of the others had reached her. He had not been afraid to rush up to an armed villain and snatch her from her perilous position. He was a man among men. Never mind if he wasn't her own personal property. Never mind if there were others in his own world who might claim him later. He was hers for to night. She would never forget it. She slept at last profoundly, with a smile upon her lips. No dream of villains, no wild automobile rides came to trouble her thoughts. And when she woke in the home station with familiar sounds outside, and realized that a new day was before her, her heart was flooded with a happiness that her common sense found it hard to justify. She tried to steady herself while she made her toilet, but the face that was reflected rosily from the mirror in her little dressing room would smile contagiously back at her. "Well, then, have it your own way for just one more day," she said aloud to her face in the glass. "But to morrow you must get back to common sense again." Then she turned, fresh as a rose, and went out to meet her fellow travelers. She went to breakfast with Sidney Graham. A wonderful breakfast in a wonderful place, with fountains and palms and quiet, perfect service. Mr. Barnard had excused himself and hurried away to his home, promising to meet Shirley at the office at 9:30. And so these two sat at a little round table by themselves and had sweet converse over their coffee. Shirley utterly forgot for the time that she was only a poor little stenographer working for her bread and living in a barn. Sidney Graham's eyes were upon her in deep and unveiled admiration, his spirit speaking to hers through the quiet little commonplaces to which he must confine himself in this public place. It was not till the meal was over and he was settling his bill that Shirley suddenly came to herself and the color flooded her sweet face. What was she better than any other poor fool of a girl who let a rich man amuse himself for a few hours in her company, and then let him carry her heart away with him to toss with his collection? She drew her dignity about her, and tried to be distant as they went out to the street, but he simply did not recognize it at all. He just kept his tender, deferential manner, and smiled down at her with that wonderful, exalted look that made her dignity seem cheap. So there was nothing to do but look up as a flower would to the sun, and be true to the best that was in her heart. She was surprised to find his own car at the door when they came out on the street. He must have phoned for it before they left the station. He was so kind and thoughtful. It was so wonderful to her to be cared for in this way. "Just as if I were a rich girl in his own social set," she thought to herself. He gave his chauffeur the orders and sat beside her in the back seat, continuing his role of admirer and protector. "It certainly is great to think you're here beside me," he said in a low tone as they threaded their way in and out of the crowded thoroughfare toward the office. "I didn't have a very pleasant afternoon and evening yesterday, I can tell you. I don't think we'll let you go off on any more such errands. You're too precious to risk in peril like that, you know." Shirley's cheeks were beautiful to behold as she tried to lift her eyes easily to his glance and take his words as if they had been a mere commonplace. But there was something deep down in the tone of his voice, and something intent and personal in his glance, that made her drop her eyes swiftly and covered her with a sweet confusion. They were at the office almost immediately, and Graham was helping her out. "Now, when will you be through here?" he asked, glancing at his watch. "What train are you planning to take down to the shore? I suppose you'll want to get back as soon as possible." "Yes," said Shirley doubtfully, "I do. But I don't know whether I oughtn't to run out home first and get mother's big old shawl, and 2 or 3 other little things we ought to have brought along." "No," said Graham quickly, with a flash of anxiety in his face. I wouldn't if I were you. They'll be anxious to see you, and if it's necessary you can run up again sometime. I think you'll find there are lots of shawls down at the cottage. I'm anxious to have you safely landed with your family once more. I promised Carol you'd be down the first train after you got your work done. How long is it going to take you to fix Mr. Barnard up so he can run things without you?" "Oh, not more than 2 hours, I should think, unless he wants something more than I know." "Well, 2 hours. It is 9:30 now. We'll say 2 hours and a half. That ought to give you time. I think there's a train about then. I'll phone to the station and find out, and let you know the exact time. The car will be here waiting for you." "Oh, Mr. Graham, that's not a bit necessary. You have taken trouble enough for me already," protested Shirley. "No trouble at all," declared Graham. My chauffeur hasn't a thing to do but hang around with the car this morning, and you might as well ride as walk. I'll phone you in plenty of time." He lifted his hat and gave her a last look that kept the glow in her cheeks. She turned and went with swift steps into her elevator. Sidney Graham dropped his chauffeur at the station to inquire about trains and get tickets, with orders to report at his office within an hour, and himself took the wheel. Quickly working his way out of the city's traffic, he put on all possible speed toward Glenside. He must get a glimpse of things and see that all was going well before he went to the office. What would Shirley have said if she had carried out her plan of coming out for her mother's shawl? He must put a stop to that at all costs. She simply must not see the old barn till the work was done, or the whole thing would be spoiled. Strange it had not occurred to him that she might want to come back after something. Well, he would just have to be on the continual lookout. For one thing, he would stop at a store on the way back and purchase a couple of big steamer rugs and a long, warm cloak. He could smuggle them into the cottage somehow, and have the servants bring them out for common use, as if they belonged to the house. He was as eager as a child over every little thing that had been started during his absence, and walked about with the boss carpenter, settling 2 or 3 questions that had come up the day before. In 10 minutes he was back in his car, whirling toward the city again, planning how he could best get those rugs and cloaks into the hands of the housekeeper at the shore without anybody suspecting that they were new. Then it occurred to him to take them down to Elizabeth and let her engineer the matter. There must be 2 cloaks, one for Shirley, for he wanted to take her out in the car sometimes, and her little scrap of a coat was entirely too thin even for summer breezes at the shore. Shirley met with a great ovation when she entered the office. It was evident that her fame had gone before her. Mr. Barnard was already there, smiling benevolently, and Mr. Clegg frowning approvingly over his spectacles at her. The other office clerks came to shake hands or called congratulations, till Shirley was quite overwhelmed at her reception. Clegg and Barnard both followed her into the inner office and continued to congratulate her on the bravery she had shown, and to express their appreciation of her loyalty and courage in behalf of the firm. Mr. Barnard handed her a check for $100 as a slight token of their appreciation of her work, telling her that beginning with the first of the month her salary was to be raised. When at last she sat down to her typewriter and began to click out the wonderful notes that had made so much trouble and put them in shape for practical use, her head was in a whirl and her heart was beating with a childish ecstasy. She felt as if she were living a real fairy tale and would not ever be able to get back to common everyday life again. At 11:30 Graham called her up to tell her there was a train a little after 12 if she could be ready, and the car would be waiting for her in 15 minutes. When she finally tore herself away from the smiles and effusive thanks of Barnard and Clegg and took the elevator down to the street, she found Sidney Graham himself awaiting her eagerly. This was a delightful surprise, for he had not said anything about coming himself, or mentioned when he would be coming back to the shore, so she had been feeling that it might be some time before she would see him again. He had just slammed the door of the car and taken his seat beside her when a large gray limousine slowed down beside them, and a radiant, well-groomed, much-tailored young woman leaned out of the car smiling at Graham, and passing over Shirley with one of those unseeing stares wherewith some girls know so well how to erase other girls. " Oh, Sidney, I'm so glad I met you !" she cried. " Mother has been phoning everywhere to find you. We are out at our country place for a couple of weeks, and she wants to ask you to come over this afternoon for a little tennis tournament we are having, with a dance on the lawn afterward." " That's very kind of you, Harriet," said Graham pleasantly, " but I can't possibly be there. I have an engagement out of town for this afternoon and evening. Give my regards to your mother, please, and thank her for the invitation. I know you'll have a lovely time. You always do at your house." " Oh, that's too bad, Sidney !" pouted the girl. " Why will you be so busy? And in the summer time, too! You ought to take a vacation. Well, if you can't come to night, you'll run down over the week end, won't you? We are having the Foresters and the Harveys. You like them, and we simply can't do without you." " Sorry," said Graham smilingly, " but I've got all my week ends filled up just now. Harriet, Let me introduce you to Miss Hollister. Miss Hale, Miss Hollister." Then did Harriet Hale have to take over her unseeing stare and acknowledge the introduction, somewhat stiffly it must be acknowledged, for Harriet Hale did not enjoy having her invitations declined, and she could not quite place this girl with the lovely face and the half shabby garments that yet had somehow an air of having been made by a French artist. "I'm sorry, Harriet, but we'll have to hurry away. We're going to catch a train at 12:15. Hope you have a beautiful time this afternoon. Remember me to Tom Harvey and the Foresters. Sorry to disappoint you, Harriet, but you see I've got my time just full up at present. Hope to see you soon again." They were off, Shirley with the impression of Harriet Hale's smile of vinegar and roses, the roses for Graham, the vinegar for her. Shirley's heart was beating wildly underneath her quiet demeanor. She had at last met the wonderful Harriet Hale, and Graham had not been ashamed to introduce her. There had been protection and enthronement in his tone as he spoke her name. It had not been possible for Miss Hale to patronize her after that. Shirley was still in a daze of happiness. She did not think ahead. She had all she could do to register new occurrences and emotions, and realize that her joy was not merely momentary. It had not occurred to her to wonder where Graham was going out of town. It was enough that he was here now. When they reached the station, Graham took two large packages out of the car and gave some directions to the chauffeur. "Sorry we couldn't have gone down in the car again," he said as they walked into the station, "but it needs some repairs, and I don't want to take as long a run as that until it has been thoroughly overhauled." Then he was going down too. He had declined Harriet Hale's invitation to go back to the cottage with her. Shirley's breath came in little happy gasps as she walked beside her companion down the platform to the train. She found herself presently being seated in a big green velvet chair in the parlor car, while the porter stowed away the two big packages in the rack overhead. Chapter 27 of the Enchanted Barn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Gail Mattern. The Enchanted Barn by Grace Livingston Hill. Chapter 27. There was only one other passenger in the car, an old man nodding behind a newspaper, with his chair facing in the other direction. Graham took a swift survey of him and turned happily back with a smile to Shirley. "At last I have you to myself," he said with a sigh of satisfaction that made Shirley's cheeks bloom out rosily again. He whirled her chair and his quite away from the vision of the old man, so that they were at the nearest possible angle to each other and facing the windows. Then he sat down and leaned toward her. "Shirley," he said in a tone of proprietorship that was tender and beautiful, "I've waited just as long as I'm going to wait to tell you something. I know it's lunch time, and I'm going to take you into the dining car pretty soon and get you some lunch. But I must have a little chance to talk with you first, please." Shirley's eyes gave glad permission, and he hurried on. "Shirley, I love you. I guess you've been seeing that for some time. I knew I ought to hide it till you knew me better, but I simply couldn't do it. I never saw a girl like you, and I knew the minute I looked at you that you were of finer clay than other girls anyway. I knew that if I couldn't win you and marry you, I would never love anybody else. But yesterday, when I heard you were in peril away off down in Washington, and I away up here helpless to save you, and not even having the right to organize a search for you, I nearly went wild. All the way down on the train I kept shutting my eyes and trying to pray the way you told your Sunday school boys how to pray. But all I could get out was, 'Oh, God, I love her. Save her. I love her.' Shirley, I know I'm not one half worthy enough for you, but I love you with all my heart, and I want you for my wife. Will you marry me, Shirley?" When she had recovered a little from her wonder and astonishment, and realized that he had asked her to marry him and was waiting for his answer, she lifted her wondering eyes to his face and tried to speak as her conscience and reason bade her. "But I'm not like the other girls you know," she said bravely. Then he broke in upon her fervently. "No, you're not like any other girl I know in the whole wide world. Thank God for that. You are one among 1,000. No, you're one among the whole earthful of women. You're the only one I could ever love." "But listen, please. You haven't thought. I'm not a society girl.
I don't belong in your circle. I couldn't grace your position the way your wife ought to do. Remember, we're nobodies. We're poor. We live in a barn."
"What do you suppose I care about that?" he answered eagerly. "You may live in a barn all your days if you like, and I'll love you just the same. I'll come and live in the barn with you if you want me to. My position? My circle? What's that? You'll grace my home and my life as no other girl could do. You heart of my heart, you strong, sweet spirit. The only question I'm going to ask of you is, can you love me? If you can, I know I can make you happy, for I love you better than my life. Answer, please. Do you love me?" She lifted her eyes, and their spirits broke through their glances. If the old man at the other end of the car was looking, they did not know it. They came back to the cottage at the shore with a manner so blissful and so unmistakable that even the children noticed. Elizabeth whispered to Carol at table: "My brother likes your sister a lot, doesn't he? I hope she likes him too." "I guess she does," responded Carol philosophically. "She oughta. He's been awfully good to her and to all of us." "People don't like people just for that," said wise Elizabeth. Harley, out on the veranda after dinner, drew near to Carol to confide: "Say, kid, I guess he has got a case on her all right now. Gee! Wouldn't that be great? Think of all those cars!" But Carol giggled. "Good night, Harley! How could we ever have a wedding in a barn? And they're such particular people, too." "Aw, gee!" said Harley, disgusted. "You girls are always thinking of things like that. As if that mattered. You can get married in a chicken run if you really have a case like that on each other. You make me tired." And he stalked away in offended male dignity. Meantime, the unconscious subjects of this discussion had gone to Mrs. Hollister to confess, and the sea was forgotten by all three for that one evening at least, even though the moon was wide and bright and gave a golden pathway across the dark water. For a great burden had rolled from Mrs. Hollister's shoulders when she found her beloved eldest daughter was really loved by this young man, and he was not just amusing himself for a little while at her expense. The days that followed were like one blissful, fleeting dream to Shirley. She just could not get used to the fact that she was engaged to such a prince among men. It seemed as if she were dreaming, and that presently she would wake up and find herself in the office with a great pile of letters to write and the perplexing problem before her of where they were going to live next winter. She had broached that subject once to Graham shyly, saying that she must begin to look around as soon as she got back to town, and he put her aside, asking her to leave that question till they all went back, as he had a plan he thought she might think well of, but he couldn't tell her about it just yet. He also began to urge her to write at once to Mr. Barnard and resign her position, but that she would not hear of. "No," she said decidedly, "we couldn't live without my salary, and there are a lot of things to be thought out and planned before I can be married. Besides, we need to get to know each other and to grow into each other's lives a little bit. You haven't any idea even now how far I am from being fitted to be the wife of a man in your position. You may be sorry yet. If you are ever going to find it out, I want you to do it beforehand." He looked adoringly into her eyes. "I know perfectly now, dear heart," he said, "and I'm not going to be satisfied to wait a long time for you to find out that you don't really care for me after all. If you've got to find that out, I believe I'd rather it would be after I have you close and fast, and you'll have to like me anyway." And then the wonder and thrill of it all would roll over her again, and she would look into his eyes and be satisfied. Still she continued quite decided that nothing could be done about prolonging her vacation, for she meant to go back to Barnard and Clegg's on the day set. "You know I'm the man of the house," she said archly. "I can't quite see it at all myself, how I'm ever going to give up." "But I thought I was going to be the man of the house," pleaded Sidney. "I'm sure I'm quite capable and eager to look out for the interests of my wife's family." "But you see, I'm not the kind of girl that has been looking around for a man who will support my family." "No, you surely are not," said the young man, laughing. "If you had been, young lady, I'd expect you'd have been looking yet, so far as I'm concerned. It is because you are what you are that I love you. Now that's all right about being independent, but it's about time to fight this thing to a finish. I don't see why we all have to be made miserable
just because there are a lot of unpleasant precedents and conventions and crotchets in the world. Why may I not have the pleasure of helping to take care of your perfectly good family if I want to? It is one of the greatest pleasures to which I am looking forward, to try and make them just as happy as I can, so that you will be the happier. I've got plenty to do it with. God has been very good to me in that way, and why should you try to hinder me?" And then the discussion would end in a bewildering look of worshipful admiration on Shirley's part, and a joyous taking possession of her and carrying her off on some ride or walk or other on the part of Graham. He did not care just now that she was slow to make plans. He was enjoying each day, each hour to the full. He wanted to keep her from thinking about the future, and especially about the winter, till she got home, and so he humored her and led her to other topics. One night as they sat on the dark veranda alone, Graham said to George: "If you were going to college, where would you want to prepare?" He wondered what the boy would say, for the subject of college had never been mentioned with relation to George. He did not know whether the boy had ever thought of it. But the answer came promptly in a ringing voice: "Central High. They've got the best football team in the city." "Then you wouldn't want to go away to some preparatory school?" "No, sir!" was the decided answer. "I believe in the public school every time. When I was a little kid I can remember my father taking me to walk and pointing out the Central High School, and telling me that some day I would go there to school. I used to always call that my school. I used to think I'd get there yet some day, but I guess that's out of the question." "Well, George, if that's your choice, you can get ready to enter as soon as you go back to the city." "What?" George's feet came down from the veranda railing with a thud, and he sat upright in the darkness and stared wildly at his prospective brother-in-law. Then he slowly relaxed, and his young face grew grim and stern. "No chance," he said laconically. "Why not?" "Because I've got my mother and the children to support. I can't waste time going to school. I've got to be a man." Something sudden like a choke came in the young man's throat, and a great love for the brave boy who was so courageous in his self-denial. "George, you're not a man yet, and you'll shoulder the burden twice as well when you're equipped with a college education. I mean you shall have it. Do you suppose I'm going to let my new brother slave away before his time? No, sir! You're going to get ready to make the best man that's in you. And as for your mother and the family, isn't she going to be my mother, and aren't they going to be my family? We'll just shoulder the job together, George, till you're older, and then we'll see." "But I couldn't take charity from anybody." "Not even from a brother?" "Not even from a brother." "Well, suppose we put it another way. Suppose you borrow the money from me to keep things going, and when you are ready to pay it back we'll talk about it then. Or, better still, suppose you agree to pass it on to some other brother when you're able." They talked a long time in the dark, and Graham had quite a hard time breaking down the boy's reserve and independence, and getting a real brotherly confidence. But at last George yielded, saw the common sense and right of the thing, and laid an awkward hand in the man's, growling out: "You're a pippin, and no mistake, Mr. Graham. I can't ever thank you enough. I never thought anything like this would happen to me." "Don't try thanks, George. We're brothers now, you know. Just do your best at school, and it's all I ask. Shirley and I are going to be wonderfully proud of you. But please don't call me Mr. Graham any more. Sid or Sidney or anything you like, but no more mistering." He flung a brotherly arm across the boy's shoulders, and together they went into the house. Meantime the beautiful days went by in one long golden dream of wonder. The children were having the time of their lives, and Elizabeth was never so happy. Shirley sat on the wide verandas and read the wealth of books and magazines which the house contained, or roamed the beach with the children and Star, or played in the waves with Doris, and wondered if it were really Shirley Hollister who was having all this good time. CHAPTER 27. Chapter 28 of the Enchanted Barn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Gail Mattern. The Enchanted Barn by Grace Livingston Hill. Chapter 28. The morning they all started back to the city was a memorable one. Graham had insisted that Shirley ask for a holiday until Tuesday morning, so that she might go up with them in the car, and have the whole day to be at home and help her mother get settled. She had consented, and found to her surprise that Mr. Barnard was most kind about it. He had even added that he intended to raise her salary, and she might consider that hereafter she was to have $10 more per month for her services, which they valued very highly. George had sent his resignation to the store, and was not to go back at all. Graham had arranged that, for school began the day after his return, and he would need to be free at once. Elizabeth, to her great delight, was to go with the Hollisters and remain a few days until her parents returned. Mrs. Graham had written from the West, making a proposition to Mrs. Hollister that Carol be allowed to go to school with Elizabeth the next winter, because Mrs. Graham felt it would be so good for Elizabeth to have a friend like that. Mrs. Hollister, however, answered that she felt it better for her little girl to remain with her mother a little longer, and that she did not feel it would be a good thing for her child, who would be likely to have a simple life before her with very few luxuries, to go to a fashionable finishing school where the standards must all necessarily be so different from those of her own station in life, and kind as the offer had been, she must decline it. She did not say that Carol had fairly bristled at the idea of leaving her beloved high school now, when she was a senior and only 1 year before her graduation. That bit of horror and hysterics on Carol's part had been carefully suppressed within the 4 walls of her mother's room, but Elizabeth, deeply disappointed, had wept her heart out over the matter, and finally been comforted by the promise that Mrs. Hollister would write and ask Mrs. Graham to allow Elizabeth to go to school with Carol the coming winter. That proposition was now on its way west, together with an announcement of Sidney's engagement to Shirley. Sidney was confidently expecting congratulatory telegrams that morning when he reached the city. He had written his father in detail all about their plans for returning, and how the work at the old barn was progressing, and Mr. Graham Sr. was too good a manager not to plan to greet the occasion properly. Therefore, Graham stopped at his office for a few minutes before taking the family out to Glenside, and sure enough came down with his hands full of letters and telegrams, and one long white envelope which he put carefully in his breast pocket. They had a great time reading the telegrams and letters. The way out to Glenside seemed very short now, watching as they did for each landmark. The children were as eager to get back as they had been to leave, and Star, snuggled in between Harley's feet, held his head high and smiled benevolently on everybody, as if he knew he was going home and was glad. They began to wonder about the chickens, and if the garden was all dried up, and whether the doves were all right. There was an undertone of sadness and suppressed excitement, for it was in the minds of all the Hollisters that the time in the old barn must of necessity be growing brief. The fall would soon be upon them, and a need for warmth. They must go hunting for a house at once. And yet they all wanted this one day of delight before they faced that question. At last they reached the final curve, and could see the tall old tree in the distance, and the clump of willows knee deep in the brook. By common consent they all grew silent, watching for the first glimpse of the dear old barn. Then they came around the curve, and there it was. But what was the matter? Nobody spoke. It seemed as if they could not get their breath. Shirley rubbed her eyes and looked again. Mrs. Hollister gave a startled look from her daughter to Graham and back to the barn again. Elizabeth and Carol were utterly silent, grasping each other's hands in violent ecstasy. The boys murmured inarticulately, of which the only audible words were, "Good night! Some class!" Doris looked for a long second, puckered her lips as if she were going to cry, and inquired pitifully, "I yant my dear barn house home. I yant to do home." And Star uttered a sharp, bewildered bark, and bounded from the car as if this was something he ought to attend to. But before anybody could say anything more, Graham brought out the long white envelope and handed it to Shirley. "Before you get out and go in, I just want to say a word," he began. "Father and I both want Shirley to have the old barn for her very own, to do with as she pleases. This envelope contains the deed for the property, made out in her name. We have tried to put it in thorough repair before handing it over to her, and if there is anything more she can think of that it needs, we'll do that too. And now, welcome home to the old barn. Mother, may I help you out?" "But there isn't any barn any more," burst forth the irrepressible Elizabeth. "The barn's gone. It's just a house." And sure enough, there stood a stately stone mansion on a wide green terrace where shrubs and small trees were grouped fittingly about, erasing all signs of the old pasture land, and the old grassy incline to the door now rolled away in velvety lawn on either side of a smooth cement walk bordered with vivid scarlet geraniums. Trailing vines and autumn flowers were blossoming in jars on the wide stone railing. The old barn door had been replaced by glass, which gave a glimpse of strange new rooms beyond, and the roof had broken forth in charming colonial dormer windows like a new French hat on a head that had worn the same old poke bonnet for years. No wonder Doris didn't recognize the dear old barn. It did seem as though a wizard had worked magic upon it. How was one to know that only a brief half hour before the old gardener from the Graham estate set the last geranium in the row along the walk and trailed the last vine over the stone wall, or that even now the corps of men who had been hastily laying and patting the turf in place over the terrace were in hiding down in the basement with their wheelbarrows and picks and spades, having beat a hasty retreat at the sound of the car coming, and were only waiting till they could get away unobserved. For orders were orders, and the orders were that the work was to be done and every man out of sight by the time they arrived. A bonus to every man if the orders were obeyed. That is what money and influence can do in a month. In due time they got themselves out of that car in a sort of bewildered daze and walked up the new cement path, feeling strangely like intruders as they met the bright stare of the geraniums. They walked the length of the new piazza in delight. They exclaimed and started and smiled and almost wept in one another's arms. Graham stood and watched Shirley's happy face and was satisfied. The first thing Doris did when she got inside the lovely glass door was to start to run for her own little willow chair and her own little old rag doll that had been left behind, and down she went on the slippery floor. And there, behold, the old barn floors too had disappeared under a coating of simple matched hardwood flooring, oiled and polished smoothly, and Doris was not expecting it. She got up quickly, half ashamed, and looked around laughing. "I was skating!" she declared with a ringing laugh. "I skated right down on my nose." Then she hurried more cautiously to the haven of her own chair, and with her old doll hugged to her breast she reiterated over and over, as if to reassure herself, "Mine, Doris! Mine, Doris!" Words would fail to describe all they said about the wonderful rooms, the walls all shining in a soft, rough finish plaster, tinted creamy on the upper half and gray below, and finished in dark chestnut trimmings; of the beautiful staircase and the wide bay window opening from the first landing like a little halfway room, with seats to rest upon. It was standing in this bay window that Graham first called Mrs. Hollister's attention to something strange and new outside beyond the house. It was a long, low glass building with green things gleaming through its shining roof. "There, mother," he said, coming up softly behind her. "There is your plaything. You said you had always wanted a hothouse, so we made you one. It is heated from a coil in the furnace, and you can try all the experiments with flowers you want to. We put in a few things to start with, and you can get more at your leisure." Mrs. Hollister gave one look, and then turned and put her arms around the tall young man, reaching up on her tiptoes to do so, brought his handsome face down to hers, and kissed him. "My dear son," she said. That was all, but he knew that she had accepted him and given him a loving place with her own children in her heart. There were shoutings and runnings upstairs and down by first one and then another. The bathrooms were discovered one by one, and then they had to all rush down into the basement by the new stairs to see the new laundry and the new furnace, and the entrance to the hothouse, and the hothouse itself, with its wealth of bloom transplanted from the Graham greenhouses. They almost forgot the chickens and the doves, and the garden was a past Eden not to be remembered till long hours afterward. The sunset was dying away in the sky, and the stars were large and few and piercing in the twilight night when Shirley and Sidney came walking up the terrace arm in arm, and found Doris sitting in the doorway cuddling her old rag doll and a new little gray kitten the farmer next door had brought her, and singing an evening song to herself. Shirley and Sidney turned and looked off at the sky where a rosy stain was blending softly into the gray of evening. " Do you remember the first night we stood here together?" Sidney said in a low tone, as he drew her fingers within his own. " I loved you then, Shirley, that first night." And then Doris's little shrill voice chimed above their murmurings. " Oh, my nice dear home, my kitty and my dolly, and my piazza, and my bathroom with a place to swim boats, and my flowers and pitty house. No more barn. Barn all dawn. Never turn bad any more. Oh, my nice, pitty, dear home." End of Chapter 28. End of The Enchanted Barn.